and he did this in front of her own family. When the neighbours came running, when the screams had stopped, and the terrible smell of burning filled the room, Michael Cleary looked at them all with absolute sincerity. He said something that chills you to the bone even now, over a century later. He said he had not killed his wife. He said the woman in the house was not Bridget. He said the fairies had taken the real Bridget, had stolen her away in the night. They left behind a changeling, a creature, a thing wearing her face but hollow inside. He said he was going to wait at the nearby fairy fort. At midnight, the real Bridget would ride out on a white horse, and he would cut her free and everything would be fine. It was not fine. Bridget Cleary was dead. She was 26 years old. She had been a dressmaker, clever and independent, more educated than most women in her village, maybe a little too independent for her husband's comfort. She had gotten sick with what was probably bronchitis, and in her feverish state Michael and several relatives decided she had been taken. They forced her to drink herbs. They held her over the fire to drive the fairy spirit out. They asked her again and again, "Are you Bridget Cleary?" When she could not answer to their satisfaction, they burned her alive. The case became a national scandal. 9 people were charged. Michael Cleary served 15 years in prison for her death, and in pubs across Ireland, people whispered a dark little rhyme for years afterward. Are you a witch? Or are you a fairy? Or are you the wife of Michael Cleary? Now, take a breath. Let that settle. You are listening to Bedtime History, and tonight we're going somewhere strange and wonderful and a little bit heartbreaking. Dim the lights, pull the blanket up. We're going deep into the medieval world, into monastery cells and royal courts and tiny village cottages where firelight flickers on the walls. We're going to ask a question that might seem absurd at first, but becomes more and more haunting the longer you sit with it. What if the fairies never took anyone? What if the people described as touched, as blessed, as cursed, as stolen by the good folk, as natural fools, as holy innocents? What if many of them were simply neurodivergent? What if they were autistic? What if the changeling in the cradle was just a baby, a child, whose brain simply worked differently? What if the monk who spent 40 years copying a single illuminated manuscript was not divinely inspired, but found deep, genuine peace in repetition? What if the mystic who saw visions of light and invented her own language was not receiving messages from God, but experiencing something her neurology created, something beautiful, real, and entirely her own? Here is the thing about history. We love to look back and diagnose. We love to say, oh, that person clearly had this condition, as if we can reach through centuries of dust. Retroactive diagnosis is a messy business, and anyone who tells you with certainty that a specific medieval figure was autistic is selling you something, probably a book with a very dramatic cover. But, and this is the important but, the traits we now associate with autism, the sensory sensitivities, the intense focus, the difficulty with social cues, the need for routine, the deep pattern recognition, the late or unusual speech, the preference for solitude, these traits did not suddenly spring into existence in 1943 when Leo Kanner published his first paper. These traits have always existed in every culture, in every century, in every corner of the world where human beings have been born with brains wired a little differently from the majority. Medieval Europe had an elaborate and sometimes surprisingly compassionate framework for understanding these differences. It just happened to involve fairies and demons, and occasionally setting people on fire. Tonight you and I are going on a journey. We're going to walk through medieval villages where mothers weep over cradles. We're going to enter monasteries where the bells ring 8 times a day, and the deep silence between them is considered sacred. We're going to sit in scriptoriums where monks bend over vellum until their eyes blur and their backs ache, and they scratch little complaints in the margins. Those margin complaints make you laugh out loud 700 years later. We are going to meet a man so large and so silent that his classmates called him a dumb ox. Then we're going to watch him become one of the greatest philosophers in Western history, and we are going to meet a woman who walled herself into a church. She never came out, and she wrote the first book in English by a woman. We're going to meet a man who cut the foot off a living pig, because a sick friend wanted pork and he could not understand why everyone was so upset about it. These are real people. These are real lives. These are real people. Real lives, and the lens through which we look at them tonight is not meant to reduce them or to slap a modern label on a medieval soul. It is meant to expand the way you think about difference, about what it has meant across centuries to have a brain that does not follow the expected script, about how the structures of the medieval world, structures we tend to think of as rigid and cruel and unforgiving, sometimes created accidental spaces of refuge for exactly these kinds of minds. Historians still argue whether the concept of neurodivergence can meaningfully be applied to people who lived before the concept existed, and that is a fair debate we'll touch on as we go. But for now, just know this: you're safe, you're warm, and we're about to walk together into a world lit by candles and governed by bells, where the boundary between the blessed and the cursed was thinner than you might think, and the fairy stories your grandmother told you might have been about people not so different from you. Close your eyes if you want to, or keep them open. Either way, we're starting in a village, a small one, somewhere in England or Ireland or the German countryside. It does not matter exactly where, because the story is the same everywhere. In that village there is a cottage, and in that cottage a cradle. And in that cradle there is a child who has stopped speaking. The world has gone quiet around him. Let us go meet them. The cottage is small. You can smell the peat fire before you see it, that earthy thick smoke that clings to everything, to the walls and blankets. You push through the low doorway and your eyes adjust to the dim light. There in the corner a woman sits beside a wooden cradle and she is crying. Her name does not matter. She has 1,000 names across 1,000 villages across 5 centuries of European history. What matters is the child in the cradle, a boy of about 2.5. What matters is what the woman will tell you if you sit down beside her and simply ask what is wrong. He was fine, she says. He was a normal baby. He smiled, he babbled, he reached for things, and then, around his 2nd year, something changed. He stopped looking at her when she called his name. The words he had started to form, mama, dog, bread, disappeared like smoke into the air. He began to scream, not ordinary crying, but long, piercing shrieks that seemed to come from nowhere and could not be soothed by any comfort. He screams when she puts him in certain clothes. He screams when the texture of his porridge changes. He will not eat anything except bread soaked in milk. It must be the same bowl and the same spoon, and God help you if you give him a different spoon, because the screaming will not stop for an hour. He lines up stones. He finds small pebbles in the yard and arranges them in rows, perfectly straight, and if you move one, even by a finger's width, he knows. He does not play with the other children. He does not seem to notice them. He sits by the wall and rocks back and forth in that steady rhythm. His rocking is so steady and so ceaseless that it makes the neighbours uncomfortable to watch. They look away, they whisper among themselves and do not meet his mother's eyes. And so the woman beside the cradle has arrived at the only explanation her world can offer her. The fairies took her real child. The thing in the cradle is a changeling. You need to understand something about the fairy faith in medieval and early modern Europe, because it was not a cute thing. It was not Tinker Bell. The belief in fairies, in the good folk, in the Ossie in Ireland, in the Tylwyth Teg in Wales, was a deeply held cosmological framework governing how people understood the unexplainable. Fairies were powerful. Fairies were dangerous. They lived in a parallel world just beneath the skin of this one, in hollow hills, standing stones, and where 2 rivers met. And one of the things fairies did, one of the things everyone knew they did, was steal human children and leave behind replacements in their place. The changeling belief shows up in every corner of Europe. Martin Luther himself wrote about changelings, and his advice for dealing with them was, let us say, not gentle. The basic pattern is always the same. A healthy, normal child suddenly changes. The child becomes withdrawn, difficult, strange, and stops developing the way other children develop. The child exhibits behaviours that the parents cannot explain, and the explanation the village tells itself is that the real child has been taken to fairyland. What remains is either a fairy child, or an old fairy disguised as a child, or sometimes just a block of enchanted wood given the appearance of a baby. The symptoms attributed to changelings across European folklore are, when you list them out, genuinely startling in how closely they map to what we now recognise as autism spectrum traits. Delayed speech or loss of speech, social withdrawal, failure to make eye contact, unusual eating habits and extreme food selectivity, distress at changes in routine or environment, repetitive movements, what the folklore sometimes calls rocking or swaying, apparent indifference to other people, including the child's own parents. These traits appear again and again. Unusual abilities in narrow areas, a changeling who could play music beautifully but could not dress itself, a changeling who could count anything but could not hold a conversation. And here is a quirky tidbit that will sit with you. In many versions of the changeling story, the way to detect the changeling was to do something impossibly strange. Something so surprising that the changeling could not help but react. The most famous version involves eggshells. You fill them with water and set them on the fire, as if you are brewing beer in tiny, tiny pots, and the changeling, unable to contain its astonishment, will supposedly sit up and reveal itself with speech. "I have lived 700 years and never seen beer brewed in eggshells," it says, thereby revealing that it is not really a baby at all. Think about what that test is actually measuring. It is measuring whether the child reacts to novelty, whether the child shows surprise at something completely unexpected, whether the child demonstrates theory of mind, the ability to understand that something unusual is happening and to comment on it. These are the social cognitive responses autistic children often express differently. The eggshell test is, in the most heartbreaking way possible, a medieval theory of mind assessment. That is what it was. That is what it will always have been. But the test did not stop at eggshells. Other methods for dealing with changelings involved iron, because fairies were believed to be unable to abide iron's touch. You would place iron tongs across the cradle. You would heat an iron poker in the fire and hold it near the child. The logic was that the fairy creature would flee. And then there was fire. If the gentler methods failed, there were traditions across Ireland, Scotland, Wales and Germany that called for placing the changeling on a hot shovel, or holding the child over the fire, or leaving it out on a hillside overnight, exposed to the elements, so the fairies would take it back and return the human child. These were not always symbolic acts. Children died, children were burned, abandoned, drowned. The Bridget Cleary case we began with was not an isolated incident. Just one of the last and best documented cases where a belief as old as Europe itself finally collided with the written record and left a scar we can still read today. And this is where the story gets complicated, because you cannot simply say those ignorant medieval people just did not understand autism. That reading is too simple, too clean. The reality is that medieval parents who believed their children had been taken by fairies were not stupid. They were terrified. They were living in a world with no paediatric neurologists. No developmental screenings, no speech therapists, no occupational therapists, no understanding whatsoever of neurological variation. They had a child who had retreated into a world they could not reach. A child who screamed at touches that should have been comforting, rejected food that should have been nourishing, and looked through them as if they were not there. And they needed an explanation, because human beings always need an explanation. The fairy story was the one their culture gave them, and they took it. And here is something that cuts both ways. Something historians still argue about fiercely. The changeling belief, as destructive as it could be, also sometimes functioned as a form of protection. If your child was a changeling, it was not your fault. Your bloodline was not cursed. You had not sinned. God was not punishing you. The fairies had chosen your child specifically because it was beautiful and healthy, and that was precisely why they wanted it. The child was desirable, not cursed. The changeling label could redirect blame away from the family and onto supernatural forces, which in a small medieval village where reputation was survival was no small thing. Some scholars argue the changeling belief actually preserved certain disabled children's lives by giving communities a framework where the child's differences were explicable and, in their way, meaningful. Others argue that this is a generous reading, and that the tests, the fire, the iron, the exposure on cold hillsides speak entirely and devastatingly for themselves. The truth, as always, lives somewhere in between, somewhere in the smoky light of that cottage where the woman sits beside the cradle and weeps, and the child rocks back and forth, in a rhythm that is ancient and unknowable and entirely his own. You sit with her for a moment. You cannot change anything. This is history. But you can notice, as you rise to leave, that the boy has arranged his pebbles in a perfect spiral on the floor, and that it is, in its strange way, beautiful. You step back out into the village. The air is cold, the stars are very bright, and somewhere, not far away, a bell is ringing. Follow it. The bell rings again, clearer now, pulling you forward through the cold dark toward whatever comes next in this long, strange history. The bell rings at midnight, and it rings at 3 in the morning, and it rings at 6, and at 9, and at noon, and at 3 in the afternoon, and at 6 in the evening, and once more at nightfall, 8 times a day, every week, every month, every year, for centuries. The bell does not care if you're tired. The bell does not care if you're sick. It rings regardless every time without mercy or pause. The bell does not care if it is Christmas, or if the plague is at the gate, or if the king has ridden up demanding hospitality. The bell rings, and when the bell rings, you move. You're walking up a muddy path toward a Benedictine monastery somewhere in Central Europe. It could be the 11th century, the 12th, or the 13th. The rule of St. Benedict governs every minute of life inside these walls. It was written in the 6th century and barely changed for 1,000 years. That is not a typo. 1,000 years of the same schedule. The same expectations, the same rhythm of prayer and work and silence. Imagine writing an employee handbook still followed word for word after 1,000 years. That is what Benedict of Nursia accomplished, and whether he knew it or not, he may have accidentally created one of the most autism-friendly environments in human history. Here is the schedule. You wake at midnight for matins, the longest prayer service of the day, psalms and readings in the dark while the world sleeps. Then you go back to bed briefly until 3 in the morning when the bell calls you to Lauds, then sleep again until prime at 6. Then terce at 9, then sext at noon, then none at 3. Prime at 6 marks the true beginning of the working day for every monk. Then vespers at 6, then compline at nightfall, the last prayer of the day, after which the great silence begins, and no one speaks until morning. Between prayer hours you work, you eat, you read. Everything happens at the same time every day, governed by the bell, structured down to the quarter hour. The Benedictine motto is ora et labora, pray and work. The entire architecture of monastic life is designed to eliminate uncertainty and remove the need for decision-making. It creates a world in which you always know exactly what you're supposed to be doing, and exactly when you are supposed to be doing it. Now, if you know anything about autism, your ears just perked up. What you have just described is a rigidly structured environment with predictable routines and minimal social demands. Long periods of silence, repetitive activities, clear rules, and a bell that tells you exactly when to transition from one activity to the next. This is essentially a therapeutic environment designed by a 6th century Italian saint who had never heard the word autism and would not hear it for another 1400 years. Think about what monastic life removes. It removes the chaos of the marketplace, the unpredictability of secular social life, the constant demand to read social cues, and the constant demand to navigate complex relationships, make small talk, and perform the 1,000 tiny acts of social theatre that neurotypical people do without thinking. In the monastery you do not need to make small talk. In fact, you are forbidden from making small talk. Many Benedictine houses observed strict silence outside prayer hours. Even where conversation was permitted, it was regulated, purposeful and brief. Idle chatter was a sin. The rules handled the weight of every social interaction, so you did not have to. Think about what a relief that would be for someone who has spent their entire life struggling with conversation, who never knows when to speak or what to say, or how to read the expression on another person's face. In the monastery, that struggle simply vanishes. The rules handle everything, every hour, every day. The work that monks did, copying manuscripts, tending gardens, brewing beer, crafting illuminated letters, these were repetitive and detail-oriented solitary tasks that rewarded focus and patience. Tasks demanding the ability to do the same thing, over and over and over with exacting precision, for years on end, without complaint or boredom. The primary intellectual labour of medieval monasticism was essentially a special interest turned into a vocation. You find one thing, you do it deeply, you do it beautifully. You do it for God, and nobody tells you that you are too intense or too focused, or that you need to lighten up or be more social. They tell you that your focus is holy. They tell you that your dedication is a form of prayer. They tell you that your quality of mind makes you blessed inside these walls. Historians still argue whether monasteries deliberately attracted neurodivergent individuals, or whether it was simply a happy accident of structure. There is evidence on both sides. Medieval families often gave their unusual children to the church, a practice called oblation, in which a child was dedicated to a monastery at a very young age. Sometimes as young as 5 or 6. The reasons were varied: too many children, not enough food, a desire for spiritual merit, or a child simply too different for village life. The monastery was a socially acceptable place to put a child who was different, and unlike the fairy hill or the hot shovel, it was a place where that child might actually thrive. On the other hand, monastic life was genuinely hard, and not everyone who entered adapted well. The historical record is full of monks who struggled, who ran away, who broke the rules, who fought with their brothers and were driven mad by the silence and the repetition. For every monk who found peace in the routine, there was probably another who found it suffocating. The monastery was not a paradise for all, and we should be careful about romanticising it. Not every mind found peace within those walls. But here is a quirky tidbit. Many Benedictine houses developed elaborate systems of hand signals to communicate during periods of silence. At Cluny there were over 100 standardised signs. Bread, wine, fish, book, candle, come, go, stop. The monks created a visual communication system that bypassed the complexities of spoken conversation and reduced it to its most concrete elements. If you struggled with the ambiguity of spoken language, with tone and implication, and the unspoken rules of conversation, a system of clear, unambiguous hand signals would be a godsend. Literally. You're inside the monastery now. The walls are thick stone, cool even in summer, and the air smells of beeswax and old wood and something else. The cloister is a square of open sky surrounded by covered walkways, and monks move through it silently, their sandals whispering on the stone. Nobody looks at you, nobody greets you, nobody expects anything of you except that you be quiet, follow the bell and do your work. The bell rings. It is time for sext, the midday prayer. You follow the monks into the chapel and stand in the dim golden light. Around you, voices rise in plainchant. This same melody sung in this same place at this same hour for hundreds of years, so predictable and so beautiful, that you feel something in your chest loosen, some knot of anxiety you did not even know was there. This is what structure feels like when it is not punishment. This is what routine feels like when it is not prison. This is what the medieval world accidentally offered to minds that craved exactly this. The chant ends, the silence returns, and the bell, faithful as always, tells you what comes next. What comes next is the scriptorium. Follow the corridor to the left, through the heavy oak door into the room where the real magic happens. This is where it all began. The room is not large. It is long and narrow, with high windows on one side that let in as much light as a medieval architect could manage. Which is to say, not quite enough. You will squint here. Everyone squints here. After a few years, most monks in this room will need reading stones. Polished pieces of beryl or quartz that magnify the text. The medieval ancestors of reading glasses. Some of them will go half blind. They do not stop working. There are wooden desks arranged in rows, each one angled like a drafting table, and at each desk sits a monk with his head bowed low over a piece of vellum. Vellum is animal skin, usually calf or sheep, scraped and stretched and treated until it is smooth enough to hold ink, and it is expensive. A single Bible might require the skins of 250 calves. You do not waste vellum. You do not make mistakes on vellum. And if you do make a mistake, you do not cross it out or start over. You take a small, sharp razor and scrape the error away, carefully and delicately. One thin layer of skin at a time until the surface is smooth enough to write on again. Then you write the correct word and you move on. You do not think about the hour you just spent fixing a single letter. There are 600 more pages to go and you will be working on this book for 3 years. Welcome to the scriptorium. The rules here are strict. You may not speak. You may not hum. Silence is the first and absolute law of this room. You may not tap your fingers or shift in your seat or make any sound that might distract the other copyists. The work requires absolute concentration. The penalties for breaking that concentration are real. In some houses, a monk who ruined a page through carelessness could be put on bread and water for days. The text you are copying is sacred. You are not writing words on a page. You are preserving the word of God letter by letter, stroke by stroke. Every error is not just a mistake, but a small act of desecration. And yet, here is the thing that most people miss when they think about medieval scribes. For some of the monks in this room, this is not punishment. This is not drudgery. This is the best part of their day. This is the part where everything else falls away, where the noise in their head quiets, where the world shrinks to the size of a single line of text. They enter a state of focus so deep and so total that hours pass like minutes, and the bell for Vespers startles them every single time. You're watching a monk work. His name does not matter. Let us call him Brother Marcus, because every scriptorium needs a Brother Marcus. He is copying the Gospel of John, and he has been copying the Gospel of John for 14 months. He is on chapter 17. He will not finish this book for another year and a half. When he does, he'll begin another one. He's been doing this for 22 years. He is very, very good at it. Watch his hands. The quill moves with a steadiness that borders on mechanical, never faltering, never hesitating across the vellum. Each letter is formed the same way every time, the same angle, the same pressure, the same tiny flick at the end of each stroke. He's not thinking about the words, not consciously. He knows this text so well that his hand moves almost on its own, the way a pianist's fingers move across familiar keys. His world has narrowed to the width of the cut-out window in the parchment that covers his work, a small rectangular opening exposing only the line he is currently copying. This is a real device that medieval scribes used, a frame that limited their field of vision to a single line of text, reducing visual distraction and helping them maintain their place. It is, without exaggeration, a medieval version of a focus tool, a physical accommodation for the demands of sustained attention across hours of meticulous copying work. Brother Marcus does not find this work boring. He finds it peaceful and necessary, the way breathing is necessary, the way stillness is necessary at the end of a long day. When the bell rings and he has to stop, there is a moment, a brief, involuntary flinch, where the interruption physically pains him. Then he puts down his quill, covers his work, and goes to prayer. And when prayer is over, he comes back and he picks up where he left off, and the peace returns. Not every monk felt this way. And we know this because of one of the most delightful quirks of medieval manuscript culture, the margin complaints. Monks were forbidden from altering the sacred text they were copying, but the margins were sometimes treated as a kind of private notebook, a place where a scribe could scratch a few words that no one would read for centuries. And what they wrote there is so human, so raw, so perfectly recognisable across 700 years of distance. It makes you want to reach through time and pat them on the back. Oh, my hand, that one shows up a lot in the margins. Writing is excessive drudgery. It crooks your back, it dims your sight, it twists your stomach and your sides. One Irish monk wrote, "New parchment, bad ink, I say nothing more." Another scribbled, "Now I have written the whole thing. For Christ's sake, give me a drink." One particularly desperate soul simply wrote, "Oh God, this vellum is hairy," which sounds like a complaint about the writing surface, but could be a metaphor for his entire life. And there is a famous marginal note from a 9th century Irish manuscript, where the monk stops his copying to write a short poem about his cat, Panga Ban, who hunts mice while the monk hunts words. It is one of the most beloved poems in the Irish language, written in the margins of a theology textbook by someone who was supposed to be working. These margin scribblers, these frustrated monks, they are the ones for whom the scriptorium was a cage. The repetition was torment, the silence was oppressive. The years of copying the same kinds of text over and over felt like a slow death of the spirit, and their complaints are valid and vivid and funny and sad. But the monks who did not complain, the ones who left no margin notes because they were too absorbed in the work to think of anything else, those monks fascinate me. The ones who spent decades at the same desk producing page after page of flawless identical text, whose handwriting stayed so consistent that scholars can barely tell early work from late. Those monks are the ones who make you wonder, because that level of sustained repetitive focus, finding deep satisfaction in the exact same task every day for decades, that is not common. That is not the default setting for the human brain. That is something specific, something unusual, something we have a name for now, even if they did not then. Historians still argue whether the great medieval manuscripts were products of devotion, compulsion, or some combination of the two that resist easy categorization. The Book of Kells, the Lindisfarne Gospels, the Winchester Bible, works of staggering detail and patience. The monks who created them are largely anonymous. We do not know their names, we do not know their stories, we only know what their hands produced, and we can see what those hands were capable of producing. And what their hands produce suggests minds capable of a kind of focus that most people cannot sustain for an afternoon, let alone a lifetime. You step back from Brother Marcus's desk. He does not notice you leaving. He does not notice much of anything right now except the curve of the letter he is forming. The smell of the ink, the scratch of the quill on skin, the cut-out window framing his entire world. The bell will ring eventually. Until then, there is only this. You close the scriptorium door gently behind you. The corridor is cool and quiet. Somewhere in this monastery a boy is arriving for the very first time. He is enormous for his age. He barely speaks. His fellow students will make fun of him for years. His teachers will assume he is stupid. They are all going to be very, very wrong. The boy stands in the courtyard and says nothing and thinks everything, and the night closes softly around him. The boy is huge. That is the first thing anyone notices about him, and for a long time is the only thing most people bother to notice. He's tall and broad and heavy, with the kind of frame that suggests he should be hauling timber or working a forge, not sitting in a lecture hall. He moves slowly and speaks rarely. When he does speak, his words often seem disconnected from whatever conversation is happening around him. It is as if he is responding to a question that was asked 3 hours ago, or perhaps one that has not been asked yet. His classmates at the University of Paris, clever young men who pride themselves on quick wit and rhetorical skill, find him absolutely hilarious. They call him the dumb ox, and they do not mean it kindly. His name is Thomas, born in 1225 in southern Italy. He was born in the castle of Roccasecca near Aquino in what is now southern Italy, to a wealthy and powerful family that had very specific plans for him. He was supposed to become the abbot of the prestigious Benedictine monastery at Monte Cassino, a position that would bring honour and political advantage to the family. Instead, at about 19, Thomas announced he wanted to join the Dominicans, wandering friars who preached and begged for food across the land. This was the medieval equivalent of telling your parents you were dropping out of law school to join a garage band. His family was horrified. His brothers kidnapped him and locked him in the family castle for nearly 2 years. According to one account, they even sent a woman to his room. They sent her to seduce him out of his vocation. Thomas reportedly chased her out with a burning log taken from the fireplace. Whether or not it actually happened, that story tells you something about the intensity of his convictions and his general approach to unexpected social situations. He eventually escaped, or was released, or his mother finally gave in, accounts vary, and he made his way to the University of Paris. There he studied under Albertus Magnus, known as Albert the Great, one of the most celebrated and brilliant scholars in all of Europe. And it was there, in the lecture halls and disputations of Paris, that the nickname stuck. The dumb ox, the big, silent, strange young man. He sat in the back, said nothing, and seemed to his peers to be utterly out of his depth, a dull ox in a hall of quick minds. There is a story, told so many times in so many versions that historical truth is probably buried under layers of hagiographic polish. Thomas was so quiet in class, so apparently unresponsive, that his fellow students assumed he simply could not keep up with the lessons. One classmate, feeling generous, offered to tutor Thomas, to go over the lesson material carefully and help him understand the difficult passages. Thomas accepted quietly, and the tutoring sessions began. They continued for some time, with Thomas saying almost nothing at all throughout each one. Then, during one session, the would-be tutor got confused by a difficult passage and simply could not work his way through it. Thomas, who had said almost nothing during these sessions, calmly and methodically explained the passage with startling depth and precision. He kept explaining, unspooling the logic of the argument until the tutor sat there with his mouth open. The sessions ended after that. Albert the Great figured it out first. The historical record suggests Albert noticed something in Thomas that everyone else had entirely missed. Not stupidity, but a different kind of intelligence. One that operated on its own timeline and moved at its own remarkable depth. The famous quote attributed to Albert, and we should be careful with quotes attributed to medieval figures since they accumulate embellishments like barnacles, is this: "You call him the dumb ox, but I tell you that this ox will bellow so loud that his bellowing will fill the whole world." Albert was right. Thomas Aquinas went on to produce the Summa Theologica, one of the most important philosophical and theological works ever written. It is a comprehensive synthesis of Christian theology with Aristotelian philosophy, still studied, still debated, still foundational to Catholic thought nearly 8 centuries later. He wrote millions of words. He dictated to multiple scribes simultaneously on different topics, switching between them without ever losing his train of thought. His memory was described by contemporaries as essentially perfect. He could recall entire books verbatim after reading them only a single time. He claimed to have memorized the entire Bible. Now let us talk about his traits, with full honesty about what we're actually doing here. We cannot diagnose Thomas Aquinas. He has been dead for 750 years. We cannot interview him or observe him in any way. What we can do is look at the descriptions that survive, written by people who actually knew him, and notice patterns that are interesting. The silence. Thomas was not merely quiet, he was described as profoundly, almost pathologically silent, especially in all ordinary social situations. In lectures and disputations, where other scholars competed fiercely to be heard, Thomas often said nothing until he was directly called upon. He did not banter. He did not charm. When thinking, which was most of the time, he retreated into a complete and total interior world. The focus. Thomas's ability to concentrate on a single intellectual problem for extended periods was legendary even among medieval scholars, who were not lightweights. There are accounts of him becoming so absorbed in thought that he would miss meals and prayer services, utterly oblivious to people speaking directly to him. At a dinner hosted by King Louis IX of France, Thomas sat in complete silence for the entire meal, lost entirely in his own thoughts. He suddenly slammed his fist on the table and announced, "And that will settle the Manichees!" startling every single guest at the royal table. He had been working out a theological argument in his head the entire time, paying no attention whatsoever to the king, the food, or the occasion. Louis, to his credit, immediately called for a scribe to take down whatever Thomas had just figured out while seated at the royal table. The routine. Thomas's daily life, once he had established himself as a scholar, followed a rigid and entirely invariable pattern repeated for decades. He said Mass early in the morning, then attended another Mass, then lectured, then dictated, then ate sparingly and without apparent interest in food. Eating sparingly was unusual in an era when meals were one of the primary forms of social interaction and entertainment among medieval scholars. He prayed, then dictated more, then retired early. He performed this same sequence every single day, with almost no variation, for many decades. The sensory and social peculiarities. Thomas was described as clumsy, physically awkward, bumping into things, seemingly unaware of his own body in space. His personal appearance was of no concern to him whatsoever. He was not interested in social status or in political manoeuvring of any kind. He was not interested in the complex web of alliances and rivalries that defined academic life in the great halls of medieval Paris. He could be blunt to the point of social obliviousness, saying things that were intellectually precise but utterly and catastrophically socially awkward. And the memory, extraordinary, encyclopedic, apparently limitless. The ability to absorb vast amounts of information and organize it with astonishing internal precision. This capacity for deep systematic retention and recall, building immense internal libraries of knowledge and navigating them effortlessly, shows up again in descriptions of autistic individuals. Historians still argue whether Thomas Aquinas' remarkable traits constitute evidence of autism or simply the expected characteristics of a deeply introverted and profoundly intelligent man. The medieval world had very different social expectations. Silence was valued. Contemplation was valued. Being in your own inner world was a vocation, not disorder. The honest question becomes, are we seeing autism, or a culture that made space for traits that our own modern culture tends to pathologize? We cannot be certain. Thomas Aquinas was a man who was mocked for his differences, dismissed as stupid, and underestimated by nearly everyone who ever met him. And he turned out to be one of the most powerful and original thinkers in the entire history of Western civilization. Albert was right. The monastic world, the world of bells and silence and structure, gave Thomas precisely the space he needed to become what he became. The dumb ox bellowed, and the world listened carefully, and it is still listening to the echoes of that bellowing nearly 800 years later. You step out of the lecture hall into the noise. Paris is loud and alive all around you, but you find yourself thinking only about silence. About the kind of silence that is not emptiness but fullness, not the absence of thought, but thought so deep it has no room left for words. There are more people to meet. A woman who saw visions of light. A man who cut a pig's foot off with the very best of intentions. A woman who bricked herself into a wall and wrote a masterpiece. Those stories are for later. For now, let the silence settle, and the dumb ox rest in his hard-won peace. And speaking of minds that refuse to sit quietly in a corner, let's leave Thomas in his great wooden chair, still muttering about angels, and travel west along the Rhine. The river is wide here and slow, and the vineyards climb the hillsides in neat rows that would satisfy even the most particular soul. The year is 1100 and something, and you are walking toward a Benedictine monastery perched above the water like a bird that landed there and simply forgot to leave. Inside those walls, a girl is about to change the entire medieval world, and she's going to do it while everyone around her assumes she is either a saint or profoundly unwell, possibly both, almost certainly both. Her name is Hildegard, and you have probably heard of her because she keeps showing up in the most unexpected places. She's on Spotify, in theology textbooks, in medical journals. She once appeared on a German postage stamp looking deeply unimpressed, which frankly seems about right. But before she was any of those things, she was a 3-year-old child standing in a field near Birmingham, staring at something no one else could see. You crouch down next to her, this tiny medieval toddler in the tall grass, and she's watching the sky with an intensity that borders on alarming. "I saw a light," she will write decades later, describing this moment. "A light so great that my soul trembled." She is 3. Most 3-year-olds tremble because someone gave them the wrong colour cup. But Hildegard is watching cascading patterns of brilliance pour across her field of vision. She's trying very hard to understand these visions, and she will keep trying for the next 80 years. Here is the thing nobody talks about enough. She kept them secret. For decades she saw blazing, shimmering, pulsing light from the time she could form memories. And she told almost no one, because even at 3, even at 5, even at 8 she understood. In whatever way a small child understands these things, what she experienced was not what other people experienced. She looked around and saw that the world did not shimmer for everyone else. She noticed the gap and filled it with silence. That combination, extraordinary sensory experiences, acute awareness of being different, and a strategic decision to mask those differences, should ring some bells. Then you have not been paying attention to this story, but we will come back to that. First, we need to talk about what happened to Hildegard when she was 8, because it is one of those medieval facts that hits you in the chest when least expected. Her parents, Hildebert and Mechthild, solid, respectable, minor nobility, had 10 children. Hildegard was the 10th, and in a tradition that was common enough to have its own theology but still makes your stomach clench, they gave her to the church. She was their tithe, their 10th, 1/10 of their children, offered to God like a basket of grain or a portion of the harvest. They packed up their strange, quiet, vision-seeing daughter and delivered her to a woman named Jutta of Sponheim, who lived as an anchoress attached to the monastery of Disibodenberg. You walk through the monastery gates, and they are enormous, and they close behind you with a sound that a child would remember for the rest of her life. Hildegard is 8. She's leaving her family, her home, her fields, her sky. She's entering a small stone room with a woman she barely knows. She will live in this room, more or less, for the next 30 years. The door does not exactly close behind her, but the world narrows. It narrows dramatically, says, to stone walls and candlelight, to the rhythm of prayer, and the company of one adult woman who has chosen to wall herself away from all of human society. And here is where the story gets interesting. If you are the kind of person who finds the intersection of environment and neurology interesting, and you are, clearly, you are listening to a 2-hour video about medieval autism at what I can only assume is an unreasonable hour of the night. So yes, you are exactly that kind of person. Jutta's cell was predictable. Wildly, almost absurdly predictable. The hours of the day were divided by the liturgy of the hours: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline. Every day the same prayers at the same times in the same order. The food arrived through a small window at the same intervals. The light came and went with the sun through the same narrow openings. The routine was absolute. The sensory environment was controlled. The social demands were minimal. And into this environment you place a child who sees lights that no one else sees, who notices patterns that no one else notices, who will grow up to master music, medicine, natural philosophy, theology, and, just casually, just as a side project, invent her own language. Let's linger on that last one for a moment, because people tend to slide right past it. Hildegard of Bingen invented a language. She called it lingua ignota, the unknown language, and it contained over 1,000 words. She created an alphabet for it. She wrote glossaries. She appears to have used it in her songs and her correspondence, though scholars disagree about exactly how and why. Some say it was a mystical language, a tongue for speaking to God. Some say it was a secret code for her nuns. Some say it was, and I am not making this up, the earliest known constructed language in European history, predating Esperanto by about 750 years. 1,000 words, an original alphabet, a complete linguistic system, created by a woman in a convent on the Rhine in the 12th century, at a time when most women were not taught to read, let alone encouraged to invent new ways of encoding meaning entirely from scratch. If you have ever met a 12-year-old who spent 6 months building a language for an imaginary world, complete with grammar rules and pronunciation guides, you know exactly what kind of mind does this. A mind that cannot stop systematizing, that finds patterns irresistible, that needs to build structures and fill them with detail, and then needs to build another one. Hildegard's other interests, and I use the word interests in the way that a volcano is interested in lava, included music, botany, medicine, geology, and cosmology. She wrote Physica, a text on the natural world that catalogued plants, animals, metals, and stones. She wrote Causae et Curae, a medical text that covered everything from circulation to psychology to what we would now call gynecology. She composed 77 songs in a musical play called the Ordo Virtutum, the Play of the Virtues, which is the earliest surviving morality play with music. It has 82 melodies. She wrote them all. Historians still argue whether Hildegard's extraordinary productivity was fueled by divine inspiration, by the focused convent environment, or by something neurological, or by a neurological profile that combined hyperfocus, pattern recognition, and sensory intensity in ways that simply could not be contained. The honest answer is probably all of it, simultaneously, because that is how complicated people work, and Hildegard was possibly the most complicated person in 12th century Europe, which is saying something, because 12th century Europe was not short on complicated people. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. We are still in the cell with Jutta, and Hildegard is still a child, and she is still keeping her visions secret. And outside the narrow windows the Rhine is still flowing, slow and dark and indifferent, the way rivers always are when extraordinary things are happening on their banks. The secret breaks open in 1141. Hildegard is 42, Jutta is dead, and Hildegard has been elected magistra of the small community of nuns that grew up around their cell. She is in charge now. She has responsibilities, and nuns looking to her for guidance. And the visions will not stop. They have never stopped. For nearly 4 decades she has been seeing blazing, structured, intricate patterns of light, and she's been writing them down in private, and she's been telling almost no one. And the effort of keeping this inside is, by her own account, making her physically ill. So she tells a monk named Volmar, and Volmar, to his eternal credit, does not panic. He does not call for an exorcist, does not suggest she pray harder or eat less, or lie down in a dark room. He says essentially, write it all down, all of it, and let me help. This is, in retrospect, one of the most important editorial decisions in the history of Western literature, because what Hildegard writes becomes Scivia's, Know the Ways, and it is a masterpiece of visionary theology that will eventually land on the desk of Pope Eugenius III himself. You're sitting in the scriptorium now watching her work. The light through the windows is thin and grey. This is the Rhineland, not the Mediterranean. But Hildegard is describing light that makes the sun look like a candle, a living light that suffuses everything and reveals itself in geometric patterns of breathtaking complexity. Circles within circles, flames that do not burn, a cosmic egg, a wheel of fire with a human figure at its centre, arms outstretched, touching the edges of the universe. Modern neurologists have looked at these descriptions and said, with the careful hedge that characterises good science, that sounds a lot like a migraine aura. The scintillating scotoma, the shimmering, often geometric visual disturbance that precedes a migraine headache, can produce exactly the kind of structured, luminous visual phenomena that Hildegard describes. The fortification spectra, the zigzag patterns, the areas of brilliance surrounded by darkness. The neurologist Oliver Sacks wrote about Hildegard's visions with barely concealed excitement, recognizing in her 12th century descriptions the precise visual signatures of a neurological event that he had documented in hundreds of 20th century patients. But here is the thing, and this is where it gets genuinely interesting, where the easy explanation stops being quite so easy. Migraine auras are usually brief, lasting 20, 30, maybe 60 minutes. But Hildegard describes states of visionary awareness that lasted much longer, that coloured her entire experience of the world. Not painful episodes to be endured, but a fundamental layer of perception. Some scholars suggest what Hildegard experienced was not merely migraine, but something more complex and integral to her entire cognitive architecture. A sensory processing difference that shaped everything she saw, heard, tasted and thought. A way of being in the world that was, in the most literal sense, genuinely different. And while we are layering hypotheses, this is the kind of story where one explanation sits on top of another like blankets on a cold night. Consider the music. Hildegard's compositions are unlike anything else in medieval music. They use an unusually wide vocal range, sometimes spanning 2.5 octaves, which is wild for plainchant. Her melodies soar and dive and spiral in ways that break every convention of 12th century liturgical music. They are beautiful. They are strange. They are the sound of a mind that processes pitch and pattern differently from other minds, and that cannot be contained within the neat boxes that other composers find comfortable. She did not just write music, you understand. She composed in a way that suggests she heard music as an all-encompassing sensory experience. Her song texts describe sound as light and light as sound, harmony as a physical force binding the cosmos, not metaphor but the literal description of a synesthetic mind, that hears colours and sees sounds and finds the boundaries between senses to be far more permeable than most people find them. Now let's talk about the arguing. Because Hildegard did not simply sit in her convent writing beautiful music and having visions and being quietly remarkable. Hildegard argued. She argued with bishops. She argued with abbots. She argued with the Archbishop of Mainz. She argued on at least one memorable occasion with the Pope. Not a little bit, not politely. She wrote letters of such blazing directness that you can still feel the recipients flinching 800 years later. "You are negligent in your duties," she told one bishop. "You have been lazy," she told an abbot. "The whole church is failing," she told Pope Anastasius IV. And the fact that she phrased it as divine revelation does not diminish the absolute audacity of a nun in the Rhineland telling the Bishop of Rome to get his act together. She also went on preaching tours. Between 1158 and 1170, when she was in her 60s and 70s, in a century where reaching 60 was itself a minor miracle, Hildegard travelled through the Rhineland preaching publicly. A woman, preaching publicly, in the 12th century. This is approximately as expected as a golden retriever delivering a lecture. It was not done. It was specifically, explicitly, theologically not done. Hildegard did it anyway. And this is where the autism question becomes not just interesting but actually important. Because one of the things that characterizes autistic cognition, and I am generalizing here, and you should always be suspicious of generalizations about any group of humans, but bear with me, is a relationship to social rules that is fundamentally different from the neurotypical relationship to social rules. Neurotypical people absorb social rules unconsciously and follow them automatically. Autistic people often learn social rules explicitly, understand them intellectually, and then make a very conscious decision about whether to follow them at all. The rule exists, it is understood, and then it is weighed against logic, against ethics, against internal conviction, and if it is found wanting, it is set aside. Not out of rebellion, not out of ignorance, out of a genuine inability to prioritize convention over truth. Hildegard knew the rules. She knew women were not supposed to preach. She knew nuns were not supposed to argue with popes. She understood the conventions perfectly. She simply could not bring herself to follow conventions that she believed were wrong. And she had a divine mandate, real or neurological or both, that she held as more authoritative than any human social agreement. The Pope at the Synod of Trier in 1148 had approved her visions. Eugenius III read passages from Civias aloud and declared them genuine. So Hildegard had in effect received the ultimate permission slip from Rome itself, and she used it with an enthusiasm that borders on glee. Historians still argue whether Hildegard's extraordinary defiance was a function of personal courage, strategic genius, divine calling, or a neurological profile that processed the world differently. That simply did not process social hierarchy the way most brains do. And again, the answer is almost certainly all of the above, tangled so tightly that separating them destroys what you seek. She was the Sibyl of the Rhine. She was a doctor of the Church, though that title would not come for another 862 years. She was a woman who saw the universe in blazing light and refused, absolutely refused, to close her eyes. She died in 1179, at the age of 81, and on the night of her death her nuns reported that 2 streams of light appeared in the sky above the monastery, crossing to form a bright cross, which is either a miracle or a coincidence, or the kind of thing that happens when a person's entire life has been so saturated with light that even the sky decides to join in. You choose. Hildegard almost certainly already knew the answer, and now, perhaps, so do you. We leave the Rhine, the convent, the vineyards, and the slow grey river, and walk south into Italy where the sun is harder and the dust is thicker. The religion there is louder, more physical, and considerably more likely to involve a man taking off all his clothes in a public square. Because we need to talk about the holy fools, and to do that we need to talk about Francis of Assisi, and to talk about Francis we need to talk about Brother Juniper. And to talk about Brother Juniper, we need to talk about a pig. Specifically, a pig's foot. You're in a Franciscan friary in the Italian countryside. It is the early 13th century. The stones are warm under your sandals and someone is sick. One of the brothers, lying in bed, feverish and miserable. He wants a cooked pig's foot and has mentioned this several times. The other brothers have nodded sympathetically and done absolutely nothing. They are Franciscan friars who own nothing, have no pig, and have more pressing concerns than one man's deeply specific pork-based cravings. Enter Brother Juniper. He's heard about the pig's foot situation and is concerned. The kind of concern that does not pause to consider secondary consequences. This is a trait that will define his entire career as a Franciscan, and provide enough material for what amounts to a medieval slapstick comedy special. Juniper goes to find a pig. He finds one in a field, presumably someone's pig. This does not slow Juniper down even slightly. He has a knife. He has a sick brother. The equation is simple. Sick brother wants pig's foot, pig has feet, Juniper has knife. He approaches the pig. He removes a foot. He leaves the rest of the pig, alive, now extremely unhappy, and conspicuously three-legged. He goes back to the friary, cooks the foot, and brings it to the sick brother with the radiant satisfaction of a man who solved a problem through direct action. The pig's owner is, understandably, furious. He arrives at the friary shouting, calls the friars thieves, calls them liars, calls them names the hagiographers probably cleaned up. The other brothers are mortified. Francis is summoned, and Francis, himself no stranger to dramatic public behaviour, listens carefully to the whole story. Then he does something remarkable. He turns to Juniper and tells him to apologise, not for cutting off the pig's foot, but for upsetting the man. When the pig's owner continues to rage, Francis sends Juniper back out, and Juniper processes the instruction to make it right through a very particular mental filter. Juniper finds the man and tries to convince him that the pig should be glad to have lost a foot for such a charitable cause. He embraces the man, kisses him, and is so overwhelmingly sincere that the pig's owner eventually gives up, slaughters the rest of the pig, and donates the meat to the friars. This is not an isolated incident. This is Tuesday for Brother Juniper. The stories pile up. He gave away his clothes so often that other friars were ordered to stop him. He was found playing on a seesaw in Rome, a grown friar in his habit on a children's seesaw, and when questioned did not understand why this was inappropriate. He once prepared 2 weeks' worth of food all at once, dumping everything into a single enormous pot. Porridge, eggs, vegetables, and scraps. Brother Juniper seemed genuinely confused when the other brothers declined to eat his chaotic stew, staring at the rejected pot with bewildered innocence. He cut bells and silver ornaments off church altar cloths to give to the poor, and could not understand why the sacristan was upset, since the poor clearly needed silver more than any altar did. The other friars called him a lunatic, a disgrace to the order, simple, foolish, a liability. Francis, who talked to animals, threw himself into thorn bushes and reportedly developed stigmata, looked at Brother Juniper and said, "Would to God I had a whole forest of such junipers." A whole forest, not one embarrassing juniper to be tolerated, but a whole forest of them. This is where the concept of holy foolishness becomes genuinely radical. What Francis is saying is that Juniper's literal mindedness, his inability to grasp implied social rules, his tendency to take instructions at face value, these qualities are not flaws, they are gifts. They are, in Francis's framing, closer to God than the smooth social competence of people who always know the right thing to say. Francis called his friars jugglers for God. Joculatores domini. A juggler entertains. A juggler breaks the normal flow of things, throws objects into the air and catches them in unexpected ways. People stop and stare, and for a moment the ordinary rules of the world are suspended, and something playful and strange and free takes their place. The tradition of holy foolishness is older than Francis, going back to Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. We are fools for Christ's sake. It winds through the Eastern Orthodox tradition, where holy fools, a Eurodivian Russian, deliberately behaved in shocking ways, wearing rags, sleeping in streets, shouting prophecies in the marketplace. The holy fool's job was to be a mirror, so far outside the norms that the norms themselves became visible, became questionable, became, just for a moment, absurd. The holy fool tradition created a space, a social, theological, cultural space, in which being profoundly, unmistakably different from everyone around you was not just tolerated, but venerated. If you could not read social cues, that was because you were reading divine ones. If you could not understand why people cared about money and status, you understood something more important. If your behaviour was bizarre and incomprehensible to the people around you, that was because you were operating on a frequency that ordinary people could not receive. Historians still argue whether the Holy Fool tradition was genuinely accepting of cognitive difference, or merely a subtle form of containment, managing disruptive individuals by assigning them a respected but marginal role. There is real evidence on both sides. Some holy fools lived comfortable lives within their communities, beloved and protected. Others were beaten, imprisoned, or killed. Their holiness was recognised only after they were safely dead, and for someone like Brother Juniper, whose mind worked differently, the Franciscan friary offered something remarkable. It offered a context in which his differences were not just accepted but celebrated, a framework in which his inability to be normal was reframed as a refusal to be worldly. A community looked at his most baffling behaviours and said, yes, more of that, a whole forest of that. Whether Juniper was autistic is a question we cannot answer with certainty. He lived 800 years ago. We have hagiographic accounts, not clinical assessments, but the pattern is there, shimmering under the surface like Hildegard's visions. And it tells us something not just about Juniper, but about the medieval world, that it had spaces for different minds, strange spaces, holy spaces, spaces that came with costs, but spaces nonetheless. Now come with me to Norwich. It is the late 14th century, and England smells the way 14th century England always smells, strongly and with great variety and not always pleasantly. You're walking through narrow streets that twist like anxious thoughts, past timber-framed houses that lean toward each other conspiratorially, past a market where someone is selling eels. Someone else is arguing about the price of wool. You are heading for a church, the Church of St. Julian, which sits near the River Wensum. It sits in a part of Norwich that is old even by Norwich standards, and Norwich, as a city, is old by anyone's reckoning. You approach from the north side, and at first it looks like every other medieval parish church. Stone walls, small windows, a tower that does not quite commit to being tall. But on the south side, attached to the church like a barnacle on a hull, there is a small room with 3 windows, one opening into the church. One window opens to a servant's quarters, so food can be passed in and waste passed out. One opens to the outside world so people can come for advice, counsel and prayers. Inside this room, a woman is sitting. She has been sitting here for a long time. She will sit here for a long time more. Her name is Julian. She's writing a book that will not be widely read for another 500 years, and when read, it will prove one of the most extraordinary theological works in the English language. It is called Revelations of Divine Love, and it is the first book written in English by a woman that we know of. There are probably others. History has the memory of a goldfish when it comes to women's writing. But before we talk about what Julian wrote, we need to talk about how she got into this room. The process of becoming an anchorite is one of the most extraordinary rituals in medieval Christianity, and it tells you something important about the relationship between enclosure and peace. The ceremony is, essentially, a funeral, your funeral while you're alive. You attend your own last rites. The bishop performs the commendation of the dying over your living, conscious body. Prayers are said for the repose of your soul. You're sprinkled with holy water. In some accounts, you lie prostrate while the office of the dead is recited over you. You are, in the eyes of the church, dying to the world. The person you were is ending. The person you are becoming, the anchorite, the enclosed one, is being born. And then you walk into the cell, and in some versions of the ceremony, the door is walled shut behind you, bricked up, sealed. You are in. The world is out. You will stay in until you die, at which point the wall opens, your body is removed, the cell cleaned, and eventually someone else will walk in and the wall will rise again. Let that settle for a moment. A person, voluntarily, with full knowledge of what they are choosing, decides to be walled into a small room for the rest of their life. No travel, no variety, no spontaneous decisions, no crowds, no markets, no weather on their face except through 3 small windows, the same walls, the same light, the same prayers, every day. Your first reaction probably is horror, the reaction of a mind that values freedom and movement and novelty and choice. But consider the possibility that for some minds, this is not horror. For some minds, this is relief. Think about what anchoritic enclosure eliminates: unpredictability, the need to navigate crowds, to read facial expressions, to decode constantly shifting social dynamics. It eliminates the noise of a medieval town, the shouting, hammering, bells, animals and people, always the people, wanting things, expecting things, communicating in ways that are exhausting to decode. Anchoritic life removes all of that. It replaces chaos with order, and replaces the terrifying openness of the world with 3 windows, a set of walls, and a schedule that never ever changes. The Ancrain Vissa, a guide for anchoresses written in the early 13th century, describes the daily routine in detail that borders on the obsessive, and I mean that as a compliment. When to pray, when to eat, when to sleep, how to arrange the cell, what to wear, how to sit. A manual for the most controlled, predictable environment medieval technology could produce. By the 15th century, the anchoritic life had become so popular among women that there were twice as many female anchorites as male ones. Historians still argue whether this gender imbalance reflects genuine preference, lack of other options for women seeking autonomy, or some combination that resists simple explanation. The answer is almost certainly complicated. What is clear is that anchoritic enclosure offered something almost nothing else in medieval society offered women: solitude, silence, and total control over their own environment. Julian used hers to think. With the systematic intensity of a mind that could not be satisfied with easy answers, she thought about the nature of divine love. Her revelations of divine love begins with 16 visions, or showings, that she experienced during a severe illness when she was about 30 years old. She nearly died. She saw Christ's blood flowing, the Virgin Mary as a young girl, and the entire cosmos held in God's hand like something small and round and fragile. She wrote, "In this he showed me a little thing, the quantity of a hazelnut lying in the palm of my hand, the whole of creation the size of a hazelnut. It is one of the most famous images in English mysticism, and it was produced by a woman sitting in a stone box the size of a generous closet. What followed the visions was not a quick transcription. It was 20 years of thinking, turning the visions over, analysing them, questioning them, building a systematic theology around them. The long text of the Revelations is not a diary of mystical experience. It is a philosophical treatise that argues, reasons, considers objections, and wrestles with the problem of evil. It rivals anything produced by the great university theologians of her era, all of whom had libraries and colleagues and lecture halls, none of which Julian had. She had 3 windows and a hazelnut and a mind that would not stop working. Her most famous line sounds, out of context, like a medieval greeting card. "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well." In context, the conclusion of the most rigorous argument for divine benevolence ever constructed. It was produced by a woman who had watched the Black Death kill half of Norwich and who had nearly died herself. A woman who had voluntarily walled herself into a room for the rest of her life, and who, after 20 years of relentless thought, concluded that love was the fundamental structure of reality. It is not naivete. It is the hardest won optimism in English literature, from a stone cell, from a woman whose name we do not know for certain, and it endures. You press your face to the exterior window, the one where visitors came for counsel, and inside the cell is small and clean and very still. There is a crucifix. There is a cat. The Ancrain Vissa specifically permits anchoresses to keep a cat, which is, when you think about it, the most perfectly medieval permission imaginable. There is a desk, and on the desk pages covered in careful handwriting. And there is silence. Deep, stone-walled, absolute silence. The kind some minds find, at last, like home. You close the window, gently because Julian is working, and step back into the street, and the street hits you like a wall of sound and smell and chaos. Norwich in the 14th century is alive in the way only medieval cities are alive, aggressively and with insufficient drainage. But we are not staying. We are leaving for the countryside. We have spent a long time with extraordinary ones. Thomas Aquinas, possibly the greatest theologian who ever lived. Hildegard of Bingen, possibly the most talented polymath of her century. Brother Juniper, possibly the most memorable fool in Franciscan history. Julian of Norwich, who wrote the most profound work of English mysticism from inside a room the size of a parking space. These are remarkable people, and their stories are worth telling. But they are by definition exceptional. They made it into the historical record because they were exceptional. The historical record is a spotlight, not a floodlight. It illuminates the extraordinary and leaves the ordinary in shadow, so let us walk into the shadow. Let us walk down a muddy dirt road past hedgerows older than memory, past fields where strips of the open field system run in long parallel lines like a medieval barcode. We walk into a village. It has no name anyone will write down for another 200 years. About 40 houses, a church, a green, and a pond with ducks. You stand on the green and look around, and what you see is a community operating on principles so different from modern life that you almost need a translation guide. There is no anonymity here. Everyone knows everyone and has since birth. Everyone's grandparents knew everyone else's grandparents, and their grandparents before them. The village is a web of relationships so dense and so old, it is less a community than a single organism with 40 houses and a pond with ducks. And within this organism, people have roles. Not jobs exactly, not in the way we think of jobs. You are the blacksmith because your father was the blacksmith. You are the miller because someone built a mill and your family has been running it ever since. You are the reeve, the hayward, the alewife, the shepherd. The role comes with the life. It is not chosen so much as inherited, like eye colour or a tendency toward melancholy. Here is the question that matters. Within this system, what happens to someone who is different? Not dramatically different, just quietly and persistently different. Someone who does not follow conversations easily. Someone who prefers to be alone. Someone with an extraordinary memory for certain things and an extraordinary inability to remember other things. Someone who finds the market day overwhelming. Someone who does a single task with remarkable skill and focus but cannot manage the small talk that lubricates daily village life. The answer, which might surprise you, is they probably did okay. Not all of them, not always, but more of them, more often than you might think. Consider the shepherd. The medieval shepherd's job was to take the village's sheep to pasture in the morning, watch them all day and bring them back at evening. That is it. That is the whole job. You're alone on a hillside with animals for 10 to 12 hours a day, social demands minimal, sensory environment controlled. Wind, grass, sky, sheep. The routine is absolute. The same hills, the same paths, the same animals, season after season, year upon year, without change or surprise. For someone who finds human interaction exhausting and animal soothing, who thrives on routine, a shepherd's life is not a hardship. It is a vocation. Consider the woodcutter, deep in the forest, alone, with physical work that has a clear and immediate result. You swing the axe, the wood splits, there is no ambiguity, no subtext. The tree does not require eye contact or laugh at your jokes. The forest does not care if you're awkward at feasts. The work is rhythmic, repetitive, and deeply satisfying. Consider the herbalist, the village healer who knows every plant within a 5-mile radius, not casually, but with exhaustive, encyclopedic, borderline obsessive precision that goes far beyond professional necessity. This person can tell you that this leaf is good for fever, that root for toothache, and this berry will kill you, but only if you eat more than 6 before midsummer. This is specialised knowledge held with a passion that looks very much like what we would now call a special interest. Obsessive, exhaustive, and deeply personal. And in a medieval village, this knowledge is not a quirk. It is a survival resource. You are the person who keeps everyone alive. You are not weird. You are the person who keeps everyone alive when the physician is 3 days' ride away and charges more than anyone can afford. Historians still argue whether medieval village communities were genuinely more tolerant of cognitive difference than modern societies, or whether we are romanticising a past as cruel as any human society has ever been. The evidence is mixed. Court records and manor rolls refer to people described as natural fools or innocents, people recognised as cognitively different and often exempted from certain legal obligations. The 13th century legal text known as Bracton explicitly distinguishes between the natural fool, someone born different, and the lunatic, someone who became different through illness. Bracton assigns different legal protections to each category, creating a framework for recognising and accommodating cognitive difference, however crude by modern standards. There was, in other words, a legal framework for recognising and accommodating cognitive difference, however crude and incomplete it was by modern standards. But there were also darker threads. The changeling belief, the idea that fairies had stolen a normal child and left a strange one, is found throughout medieval folklore. It does not take much imagination to see how this belief could apply to a child who did not develop typically, who did not speak or engage socially. The changeling story is, in one reading, a way of processing the grief and confusion of having a child who is different. In another reading, it is a justification for abuse. Because if the child in the cradle is not really your child, if it is a fairy substitute, a thing, then the normal rules of care and protection do not apply. The truth, as usual, is that the medieval village was not one thing. It was not a paradise of neurodivergent acceptance, and it was not a hell of conformist brutality. It was a human community with all the complexity that implies. Some different people were cherished, some were tolerated, some were exploited, some were harmed. The outcomes depended on 1,000 variables. The specific community, the individual, the difference, the economic conditions, the local priest's theology, the family's resources, the neighbours' temperaments, and plain irreducible luck. But the medieval village had something structurally that the modern world has largely lost, and it is worth naming because it matters. It had roles that did not require social fluency. It had work that was solitary, repetitive, and skilled. It had a community structure stable enough to accommodate its members' differences. It had a pace of life that was, by our standards, glacially slow, and within that slowness there was room. Room to be quiet, room to be odd, room to know every herb in the forest and nothing about how to make small talk at a feast. Room to be the shepherd on the hill, watching the light change, counting sheep, and finding in that count not boredom but something very close to peace. You sit on the village green as the sun begins to set. The ducks are settling on the pond. Somewhere a blacksmith banks his forge, and the rhythm of that hammer has been the heartbeat of this village for longer than anyone remembers. The shepherd is bringing the flock home down the lane, and you can hear the bells on the lead ewe, soft and steady, a sound unchanged in 1,000 years. Tomorrow it will all happen again, the same roads, the same fields, the same sky, and for some minds that sameness is not a prison. It is the only ground that holds. So you have been wandering through this medieval village, watching all these people who would probably get a diagnosis today just living their lives. The quiet weaver who never looks anyone in the eye but produces cloth so fine that merchants travel 3 counties to buy it. The shepherd who talks to rocks but knows every lamb by its specific bleat. The old woman who arranges her herbs in patterns no one else understands, but who has never once mixed up a remedy in all her years of practice. They all have places here in this village. They all belong to something larger than themselves. But now you need to leave the village for a while because something is happening in the halls of power that is going to affect every single one of these people. And honestly, it is one of the most surprisingly decent things medieval England ever produced. Which is saying something, because medieval England also produced the rack. You are walking into a court of law, not a royal court with thrones and banners, but a proper legal proceeding where men in robes argue over land and property. The year is somewhere around 1324, and a document has recently been codified that is going to shape how England deals with people who are mentally different. It is called the Prerogativa Regis, which is Latin for the king's prerogative because of course it is Latin. Everything important in medieval England was in Latin, which must have been incredibly annoying and deeply frustrating for the 98% of the ordinary English population who did not speak a single word of Latin. Here is what the Prerogativa Regis says, and you need to pay attention because it is genuinely fascinating. The law establishes that when a person is deemed a natural fool, someone born with what we might today call an intellectual or developmental disability, the king himself takes custody of that person's lands and property. Now before you recoil at that, because it does sound like legalised theft, listen to the second part. The king is required by law to maintain those lands. He cannot strip them, he cannot sell them off. He must use the income from those lands to provide for the natural fool and their entire household. And when the natural fool dies, whatever property remains must be passed on to their rightful heirs. The king gets to use the profits in the meantime, sure, but the estate stays completely intact through all of this. The family does not lose their inheritance, and the land remains whole and productive for the next generation. Compare that to what happened in later centuries, the Victorian asylums, the forced sterilizations of the 20th century, the institutions where people were warehoused and forgotten. And suddenly, 1324 is looking remarkably civilized. Not perfect, not even close to perfect. But there is a foundational decency here that later generations somehow managed to lose. Now here is where it gets really interesting, because the law draws a sharp and remarkably clear line between 2 very distinct categories of mentally different people. On one side you have the natural fool, someone who has been the way they are since birth. Their condition is permanent, it is simply who they are. On the other side you have the lunatic, and yes, that is the actual legal term derived from lunar because people genuinely believed the moon could drive you mad. The lunatic is someone who has periods of mental illness but also has lucid intervals. They were not born this way. something happened to them, or something comes and goes. This distinction matters enormously, because the legal treatment is completely different. For the natural fool, the king holds custody permanently, because the condition is permanent. For the lunatic, the king only holds custody during the periods of madness, and when the lucid intervals return, the person gets full control of their property back. Medieval lawmakers looked at mental difference and said, effectively, these are two fundamentally different situations, and they require two fundamentally different responses. That is more nuanced than you will find in a lot of modern legislation, and these people thought the plague was caused by bad smells. But you're probably wondering how they actually determined who was a natural fool and who was not. You cannot exactly administer a standardized test in a world where most people cannot read. So the courts of medieval England developed their own remarkable assessment method, and honestly, when you hear the details of it, it is both genuinely heartbreaking and oddly practical. You are standing in this courtroom now, and a man has been brought before the judges. His family's land is at stake. Someone, maybe a greedy relative, maybe a concerned neighbour, maybe a lord who wants to consolidate holdings, has petitioned the court to declare this man a natural fool. So they ask him questions. Can you count 20 pence? Can you name the days of the week? Can you measure a yard of cloth? Can you tell us who your father was and where he lived? Can you tell us how old you are? These are the actual tests that determined a person's legal fate. If a person can do these things, they are not legally an idiot. And again, idiot here is a legal classification, not an insult, though it was probably both. If a person can perform these basic practical tasks of daily medieval life, the courts cannot touch their property or interfere with their affairs. That is the end of the discussion entirely. The court also considered whether the person could beget a child. The reasoning held that the ability to form that kind of relationship indicated a level of understanding. It is a strange metric by modern standards, but remember, these are people who diagnosed illness based on the colour of your urine. Context is everything. What strikes you, standing in this courtroom, is that these tests are not actually testing intelligence in any abstract sense. They are testing practical functionality. Can this particular person navigate the practical demands of daily life in medieval England? Can they handle money properly, understand the passage of time, and accurately measure quantities of goods? A person could be completely nonverbal, could have what we would now recognise as significant autism, could be utterly baffling to their neighbours in 100 different ways. But if they could count coins and name Tuesday, the law said they were competent. Their land was safe, their family was secure. And there is a quirky little detail buried in the legal records that historians love to argue about. Some of the people declared natural fools were clearly being railroaded. You find cases where families contest the designation, where neighbours testify that so-and-so can absolutely count money. He just does not like talking to strangers, especially strangers in robes who keep asking him uncomfortable questions. The system was protective in theory, but it could also be weaponized by anyone with a financial motive. Historians still argue whether these legal protections were primarily about genuine care for vulnerable people, or primarily about the crown finding a polite way to manage valuable estates. And the answer is almost certainly both, because that is how medieval law worked. Compassion and profit holding hands and pretending they were not related. You also notice something else as you watch these proceedings. The language is careful. The natural fool is never described as evil, never described as cursed, never described as being punished by God. They are simply described as someone who has always been this way and always will be. There is an acceptance embedded in the legal framework that is remarkably clear-eyed. These people are not broken versions of normal people. They're a recognised category of human being, with specific legal protections and specific rights. The king owes them care, their families owe them support, the community owes them a place. Now, is this system perfect? Absolutely not. The natural fool has no legal autonomy. They cannot make their own decisions about their property. They are, in the eyes of the law, essentially permanent children who will never grow into full legal adulthood. And underneath the protection, the profit motive is always quietly lurking in the background. The king benefits financially from every declaration of natural foolishness, which creates an obvious incentive to find more natural fools among the landed classes. You do not see a great many peasant farmers being dragged into court for evaluation, because peasant farmers simply do not have estates or lands that are worth the crown's trouble to manage. But here is the thing that keeps nagging at you as you leave this courtroom. For all its flaws, for all its patronising assumptions, this system recognised something that many later societies forgot. It recognised that people who are born fundamentally different from their neighbours deserve protection from the crown, not punishment. And it recognised that their families deserve lasting security, not shame. And it recognised that the most powerful person in the country, the king himself, had a personal obligation to make sure these people were cared for. You step back out into the street and the noise of medieval life hits you again. The carts, the animals, the shouting merchants. Somewhere in this city there is a person who cannot name the days of the week, whose land is now held by the crown, whose meals are paid for by royal income. They did not ask for this arrangement. They probably do not fully understand it. But they are fed, they are housed, their children will inherit what is rightfully theirs. And in 1324, in a world of plague and famine and war, that is not nothing. That is actually quietly something close to remarkable. And speaking of remarkable arrangements, you're about to walk into one of the strangest employment situations in all of human history. Because while the law was busy protecting natural fools in the countryside, the royal courts of Europe had discovered something entirely different to do with them. They had put them on the payroll. You are entering a palace now, not just any palace. You're walking into the court of Henry VIII, which is exactly as overwhelming as you have been led to believe. The ceilings are absurdly high, the tapestries cost more than entire villages, and everyone is dressed in enough velvet to upholster a cathedral. There are hundreds of people here, all jockeying for the king's attention, all terrified of the king's temper, all performing elaborate rituals of courtesy. And right there, sitting near the king's own chair, closer to real power than most dukes will ever get, is a man named William Summer. William Summer is Henry VIII's personal fool. Not his professional jester, mind you, but his genuine natural fool. And that particular distinction matters far more than you might initially think. In the medieval and Renaissance courts, there were two entirely different categories of court entertainer, and confusing them would have been a serious social error. The first category was the trained jester, essentially a professional comedian of the medieval world. These were sharp, witty, and highly educated men who deliberately chose this career path. They could juggle, they could sing, they could compose satirical verses on the spot. They were the stand-up comedians of their age. And they were very, very good at reading a room, which in Henry VIII's court was quite literally a survival skill. The second category was the natural fool. These were people who had what we would today recognise as intellectual disabilities, developmental differences, or autism spectrum conditions. They were not performing cleverness or rehearsing witty lines. They were simply being themselves in front of the court, and the courtiers found them entertaining, sometimes genuinely affectionate and sometimes utterly fascinating. And always a little bit like a mascot, which is the part that should make you uncomfortable because it absolutely should. William Summer falls into this second category. Historical records describe him as having what was almost certainly a learning disability of some kind. He was not performing wit. He was genuinely, naturally peculiar in ways that delighted Henry VIII, a man who was not easily delighted. Summer had a kind of unfiltered honesty that the king apparently found refreshing, possibly because every other person in the palace was lying to Henry's face. And here is the thing about Summer that historians find most remarkable. He lasted. He served not just Henry VIII, but also Edward VI and Mary I. He survived 3 monarchs, which in the Tudor court is roughly equivalent to surviving 3 volcanic eruptions while standing on the rim. Courtiers fell in and out of favour like dominoes toppling one after another. Ministers were arrested and executed on what seemed like a seasonal basis, but somehow the fool endured through it all. Now, while you are processing Summer, you need to hear about Geoffrey Hudson, because Geoffrey Hudson's story is so improbable that if you put it in a novel, your editor would reject it. Geoffrey Hudson was a dwarf. He stood about 18 inches tall at the time of his most famous appearance at a royal banquet hosted by the Duke of Buckingham. The Duke wanted to impress the Queen. He wanted to give her something memorable, so he had a very large pie brought to the table. And when the crust was broken open, out leapt Geoffrey Hudson, dressed in a tiny suit of armour, brandishing a miniature sword and looking presumably as dignified as possible. The Queen was utterly enchanted by what she'd just witnessed. She took Geoffrey Hudson into her royal household immediately, and he quickly became one of her most favoured and constant companions. He travelled with her, lived at court, received fine clothing and his own servants. He was, by the standards of the time, a success story. But he was also a spectacle. His entire value to the court was his difference. He was entertaining because he was unusual. He was kept close because he was novel. And the moment you start peeling back the affection, and the fine clothes and the servants, you find something that looks a lot like a very gilded cage. This is the tension at the heart of the natural fool tradition. On one hand, these were people who had stable employment, regular meals, warm beds, and genuine human connections. In an age when people with similar conditions might otherwise have been begging on the street or locked in a back room somewhere, William Summer was, by multiple accounts, genuinely loved by Henry VIII, and Henry VIII did not love easily or well. On the other hand, they were there to be laughed at. Not always cruelly, sometimes the laughter was warm, even tender. But the fundamental dynamic was entertainment derived from difference. The natural fool's purpose at court was to be visibly, undeniably not like everyone else. Their job description was essentially, be strange in the vicinity of powerful people. Natural fools were often given specific clothing, motley, the multicoloured patchwork we now associate with jesters. But they were also frequently given the same quality of fabric as higher-ranking courtiers. The records show payments for silk, for velvet, for fur-lined cloaks, all made up in the fool's unusual style. The court was simultaneously marking these people as different and treating them as worthy. Historians still argue whether the natural fools at court were exploited, protected, or some impossible combination of both that defies modern categories entirely. A natural fool serving a kind queen in a stable court might have had a genuinely decent life. One serving a paranoid king might have endured a nightmare dressed in silk. You watch Summer for a while longer. He's doing something with his hands, some repetitive motion, maybe playing with a bit of string or a coin. The king glances over at him and smiles, just barely, in a quiet way that softens that famous, brutal and terrifying face for the briefest of moments. And here is Summer, who performs nothing, who simply is what he is, who has found a place in the most dangerous room in England by being the one person not pretending. There is something almost beautiful about that if you do not think about it too hard, and something deeply sad if you do. You leave the court now. You have seen enough velvet and enough complicated feelings for one visit. Outside the palace walls, medieval life is carrying on, and there is a workshop down the street that you need to visit, because what is happening inside it is going to explain why some brains thrive in structured environments. You step off the palace grounds and into the narrow streets of a medieval city. Let us say London, because London in the 14th century is exactly chaotic enough to make the point, and almost immediately you notice the organisation. The surface impression is pure chaos. The streets are a disaster. There are pigs, there are open sewers. A man is shouting about fish. Another man is shouting at the man shouting about fish. A cart has gotten wedged between two buildings constructed approximately 6 inches too close together. But underneath all this glorious pandemonium, there is a structure so rigid, so precise, so obsessively organised that it would make a modern project manager weep. You are looking at the guild system, and the guild system was, without anyone intending it to be, a paradise for the neurodivergent mind. Every shop you pass has a sign hanging over its door because most people cannot read. A boot for the cobbler, a golden arm for the armourer, a striped pole for the barber. Every single one of these shops belongs to a guild, and every guild has rules. So many rules. Honestly, an almost suspicious number of rules. Let us step inside this particular workshop. It belongs to a buckle maker, not a general metal worker, mind you. This man makes brass buckles, specifically brass. If you want a copper buckle, that is a different guild entirely. If you want one made of iron, that is yet another guild. A clasp requires consulting the clasp makers. Now imagine you are a person whose brain naturally gravitates toward deep specialisation. Someone who finds comfort in routine, who thrives when the rules are clear and consistent, who can spend hours, days, weeks absorbed in a single specific task without ever feeling bored. Who notices tiny differences between similar things that most people overlook entirely? You have just described, almost perfectly, the absolute ideal guild apprentice that every medieval master craftsman dreamed of finding. Someone whose natural wiring matched the work completely. The apprenticeship lasted 7 years. 7 years of learning a single craft under a single master. 7 years of repetition, of gradual refinement, of doing the same thing over and over until the difference between your early work and your late work was visible only to experts, and then doing it some more. And the masters loved these apprentices. A master craftsman wanted an apprentice who would show up every day, follow instructions precisely and maintain consistent quality. They wanted someone who cared about whether a seam was straight. someone who noticed when the forge was half a degree too hot. There is a quirky historical detail about a hinge maker in 14th century Bruges who worked in the same small workshop for over 40 years, producing nothing but hinges. His hinges were apparently so perfectly made that they were specified by name in construction contracts for churches. He was not famous. He was not wealthy in any extraordinary sense. He simply made hinges day after day, year after year, with a level of precision and consistency that borders on the superhuman. The quality standards enforced by the guilds were frankly insane by modern standards. Products were inspected regularly. Substandard work was not just rejected, it was publicly destroyed. A craftsman who produced shoddy work could be fined, stripped of guild membership, or paraded through the streets with their bad product hung around their neck as a warning. The daily routine of a guild workshop was as structured as a monastery. You started at the same time every day, performed the same tasks, and used the same tools. You ate at specified times and finished at the same hour. The workshops had specific places where every tool was kept, and putting a tool in the wrong place was a punishable offence. And the social rules were equally explicit. Guild members were required to attend specific meetings, contribute to specific funds, participate in specific ceremonies. The expectations were laid out in advance, in writing, with no ambiguity. You did not have to guess what was expected. You did not have to read social cues or interpret subtle hints. The rules were the rules, and if you followed the rules, you belonged. For someone who struggled with unwritten social expectations, the guild offered something revolutionary. A world where all the expectations were written and spoken, clearly and repeatedly by people who would be absolutely furious if you did not follow them to the letter. Whatever the motivation, the result was a system that carved out honoured, respected, well-compensated roles for people whose brains were built for deep, narrow, obsessive focus. A system that said essentially your strange intensity is not a flaw. It is your greatest professional asset. Now make me a perfect buckle. You step out of the workshop. Your hands smell like metal and leather and wood smoke. The street is still chaos, still shouting, still pigs. But behind every door on this street, someone is quietly, methodically, obsessively perfecting a single tiny aspect of the material world. And they are being paid well to do it. And for some of them, for the ones whose brains light up at repetition, who find peace in precision, this must have felt like they were exactly where they were supposed to be. The workshop door closes behind you, and you keep walking because there is somewhere else you need to visit. Somewhere quieter. Somewhere that deals with those who needed even more support. The smell hits you before the building does. There is rosemary in it, and lavender, and something that might be chamomile. But underneath the herbs lies the unmistakable scent of illness. You push open the door, heavy oak, iron hinges that might have been made by our friend from the last section, and step inside. The room is long and narrow with beds lining both walls. Some beds are curtained. A monk moves between them, checking on patients with quiet efficiency. Medieval medicine operated on a system that was internally logical, externally insane, and absolutely sincere. At its core was the theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, which corresponded to four temperaments: sanguine, phlegmatic, choleric, and melancholic. Every illness was explained through their balance or imbalance. But what do you do with someone who has never had a baseline? Someone who has been exactly the way they are since birth? Someone who does not fluctuate between wellness and illness? The honest answer is that medieval medicine mostly threw up its hands and said, well, this must just be how God made them, and that response turned out to be surprisingly compassionate. You watch the monk approach a young man sitting on one of the beds. The young man is rocking slightly, staring at something in his hands, a piece of knotted rope. He does not look up when the monk approaches. The monk does not seem bothered by this. He checks the young man's forehead for fever, adjusts the blanket, and moves on. There is no attempt at treatment, no bloodletting, no purging, no exotic herbal concoction. The young man is simply being cared for. Natural foolishness was not treated as a humoral imbalance. The medical texts barely mention it. They recognized in their own framework that this was not a disease. You cannot cure someone of being themselves. And medieval medicine, for all its wild theories about bile and planetary influence, somehow understood this truth about natural foolishness better than later generations. And here is the historical fact that stops medievalists in their tracks. In the thousands of medieval miracle cure accounts, there are virtually no accounts of someone being cured of natural foolishness. Medieval people believed saints could cure literally anything. They believed bones in golden boxes could make the blind see and the lame walk. They recorded these miracles meticulously. And yet, when it came to natural foolishness, the medieval world seems to have collectively agreed. This is not the kind of thing that gets cured, not even by God. The scholar Irina Metzler argues that medieval people did not view natural foolishness as an illness or an affliction. It was more like being born with red hair, a characteristic, not a pathology. The natural fool was not sick. They were simply made differently. And if God had made them this way, then asking God to unmake them was potentially inappropriate. This is not to say that medieval attitudes were uniformly gentle. Treatments applied to lunatics could be genuinely horrifying. There are records of people being chained and subjected to violent exorcisms. Historians still argue whether medieval tolerance for natural foolishness was genuinely compassionate, or simply the result of a medical system that lacked the tools to pathologize it. But it also might not matter to the young man on the bed, still rocking gently, still looking at his knotted rope, still being brought his meals and allowed to simply be. You leave the infirmary. The herbs still linger in your nose. You have one more place to visit and it is close by, just down the road, past the market square. A quirky thing to carry with you as you walk. Medieval physicians sometimes prescribed laughter as a treatment for melancholy. Actual prescribed laughter. The building you're approaching does not look like much. It is stone, low-slung, tucked against the outer wall of the city near a church. There is a small garden to one side, poorly maintained but earnest. Someone has planted cabbages in rows that are not quite straight. A goat is tied to a post near the entrance. This is St. James Hospital in Chichester, and what happens inside it is one of the quiet, unremarkable, genuinely decent things that the medieval world produced. Its charter survives, and in it there is a line medievalists return to again and again. The hospital was established to care for 6 cripples, 2 without legs, and 2 idiots. 10 people. That is the entire capacity. 10 specific people, categorized with the brutal precision of a world that did not have the luxury of euphemism. And yet those 10 people had beds and meals. They had a roof overhead and someone whose entire professional purpose was making sure they were warm and fed and comforted. You step inside the building. The interior is simple, a long hall but smaller and more domestic than the infirmary. This is not a place for healing. This is where people live. The 2 residents described in the charter as idiots are somewhere in this building right now. Maybe one is in the garden, poorly arranging cabbages. Maybe one is sitting by the fire in the main hall, doing the same thing they do every day at this hour because routine is comfort and comfort is everything. These 2 people are here because of a concept called the 7 comfortable works, more commonly known as the 7 corporal works of mercy. Feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, clothe the naked, shelter the stranger, visit the sick, visit the imprisoned, bury the dead. These were not suggestions, they were obligations. You did not build a hospital because you were a good person. You built a hospital because if you did not, you were going to hell. Which is admittedly a less inspiring motivation than pure altruism, perhaps. But it proved considerably more effective at actually getting real hospitals built across medieval Europe in every town. And here is the thing that surprises people about these institutions. They were not terrible. They were not the Victorian workhouses. They were small, local and personal. The residents could not leave when they wanted. They could not choose their meals or schedule, but they were also not abandoned, not hidden, not treated as shameful secrets. Across medieval Europe, similar institutions existed in nearly every town of any size. They were funded by guilds, merchants, noble families, and most commonly by the church itself. Many hospitals had specific rules about food quality. The food was supposed to be the same quality as what the staff ate. One charter specifies white bread, not brown. The 2 idiots at St. James were not hidden away. They were fed, housed, and included in the daily life of the institution. They attended chapel and ate with everyone else. But medieval charity always came with conditions, and the biggest condition was religious conformity. The price of your bed was participation in the spiritual life of the hospital. Your disability made you useful. Your prayers, offered from a state of innocence, were considered especially valuable. The natural fool's prayers were thought to go straight to God. People with intellectual disabilities occupied a paradoxical position. They were the lowest in social status and legal autonomy, but the highest in spiritual purity. They were simultaneously the most vulnerable and the most holy. And that strange contradictory position afforded them a degree of protection that pure social status never could have. The practical result was that a person who could not care for themselves had a place to live, food to eat, and a community that believed caring for them was a sacred obligation. You stand in the doorway of St. James for a moment longer. The goat is still watching you. Inside, someone is singing a hymn slightly off-key, in a voice that does not quite follow the melody, but seems happy enough to be in the general vicinity of it. The cabbages continue to grow in their not quite straight rows. It is not paradise, not even close, but it is a world where someone thought to write in an official document that two people who could not care for themselves deserved care, where someone actually counted them and wrote their names into the record, where someone looked at the available space and the limited resources and deliberately, intentionally, made room for them anyway. And as you turn to walk away, toward whatever the next century has in store, you carry with you the quiet, stubborn, complicated truth that the medieval world sometimes got the basics right. Feed people who cannot feed themselves, house people who have nowhere else to go, count every single person, and then make room for them, because that is what a decent society does. It is not a cure, never meant to be, but it is enough to build a life on. And in Chichester, for two people whose names we will never know, it was. And so you leave the almshouses behind, leave the quiet hum of community care and charitable obligation, and you walk north. You walk through mud and rain because of course you do. This is England, and eventually you find yourself approaching a city that smells like wet stone and old books. You're approaching Oxford, and the particular brand of intellectual arrogance that will persist in this place for roughly 800 years. Not the Oxford of dreaming spires and rowing competitions, and students in subfusc pretending they didn't study. No, this is Oxford in the 13th century, which means it is a collection of draughty halls, a handful of churches repurposed as lecture rooms, and a truly alarming number of young men arguing about Aristotle at volumes that would get them thrown out of a modern library. The university is young, it is chaotic. It is in many ways a magnet for exactly the kind of mind we have been circling around this entire story. You push through the gates and into a narrow lane, and you hear it before you see it. A voice, rapid and intense, rattling off something about optics, about the refraction of light through water droplets, about the precise geometry of rainbows. The voice belongs to a Franciscan friar, a man in a rough brown robe with ink-stained fingers, and the kind of feverish energy that makes the people around him simultaneously fascinated and exhausted. His name is Roger Bacon, and he is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most extraordinary minds of the medieval world. He is also, by any reasonable measure, an absolute nightmare to be around. Let's talk about Roger Bacon, born around 1214, probably in Ilchester, Somerset. He studied at Oxford and Paris, joined the Franciscan order, and then proceeded to spend the rest of his life doing something that Franciscans were not, strictly speaking, supposed to do, which was think original thoughts at an alarming rate, and then write them down in enormous obsessive detail. His contemporaries called him Dr. Mirabilis, the wonderful doctor, which sounds like a compliment, until you realise it was partly an expression of bewildered awe, the kind of nickname you give someone when you genuinely cannot figure out what is happening inside their head. And what was happening inside his head was a lot. Bacon wrote about magnifying glasses. He wrote about eyeglasses for correcting vision, describing the principles of how lenses could be ground and shaped to help people see, decades before spectacles became common in Europe. He wrote about the possibility of self-propelled carriages, vehicles that could move without horses. He wrote about flying machines. He wrote about ships that could cross oceans powered by mechanisms rather than oars or sails. He described something that sounds suspiciously like gunpowder, detailing the proportions of saltpeter, charcoal and sulphur with the precision of a man who had either experimented extensively or who had access to information filtering in from China and the Islamic world, or both. He wrote about all of these things in the 13th century, when most of Europe was still arguing about whether the Earth was at the centre of the universe, which, to be fair, it isn't. But they wouldn't sort that out for a few more centuries. Here is the thing about Roger Bacon that matters for our story. It is not just that he was smart. Lots of people were smart. It is the way he was smart. It is the obsessive, relentless, all-consuming nature of his intellectual pursuits. He didn't just dabble in optics. He wrote hundreds of pages about optics. He didn't just mention the possibility of flying machines in passing. He described them with the focused intensity of a man who had been thinking about nothing else for months. His major work, the Opus Majus, the Opus Minus, the Opus Tertium, are not casual surveys of knowledge. They are monumental, exhaustive, almost compulsive catalogues of everything he believed could be known and tested and proven through direct observation and experiment. And that word, experiment, is the key. Because Bacon was one of the earliest European voices to insist, loudly and repeatedly, and to anyone who would listen, and quite a few people who would not, that knowledge had to be grounded in experience, in testing, in looking at the actual world, rather than just reading what Aristotle said about the world. His mentor, Robert Grosseteste, the Bishop of Lincoln and another Oxford man, had already begun developing what we might recognise as an early version of the scientific method. The idea that you form a hypothesis, you test it, you observe the results. Bacon took this and ran with it. He ran with it so far and so fast that his own religious order eventually decided he needed to be stopped. Here is your quirky tidbit for this section, and it is also deeply sad. In 1277, or possibly 1278, the exact date is disputed. Because medieval record-keeping was not always precise, Roger Bacon was imprisoned by the Franciscan order. The charge, as far as we can reconstruct it, was for suspected novelties in his teaching. Suspected novelties. Let that phrase roll around in your mouth for a moment. He was locked up not for heresy exactly, not for denying God or the Church, but for novelties. For thinking new things. For the crime of having ideas that nobody had had before, or at least ideas that nobody was supposed to have yet. He may have been imprisoned for as long as 14 years, though historians still argue whether the imprisonment was as harsh as some accounts suggest, or whether it was more of a house arrest, a firm suggestion that he sit down and stop alarming everyone. Either way, let's just sit with this. A man whose mind worked in ways that were fundamentally different from his peers. A man who could not stop pursuing knowledge, who could not stop writing, who could not stop thinking in these vast, interconnected, obsessive patterns. A man who looked at the world and saw not what was, but what could be. Flying machines, self-propelled carriages, lenses that could correct human vision, and who wrote it all down with the feverish intensity of someone who genuinely could not help himself. And his reward for this was a cell. Now, I am not going to sit here and diagnose Roger Bacon with autism across a distance of 750 years. That would be irresponsible and also slightly ridiculous. But I am going to ask you to notice the pattern, because we have been noticing patterns all night. And this one is hard to miss. The obsessive focus on specific subjects, the inability to modulate his output to match social expectations, the deep, consuming interest in systems and how things work, the apparent indifference to the social consequences of his behaviour, because Bacon did not stop writing controversial things after being warned. He kept going. He always kept going. Whatever was driving his intellectual engine, it did not have a brake pedal. And here is what is interesting about the medieval university system. In some ways, it was the perfect environment for minds like this. The entire structure of medieval scholarship was built on obsessive attention to detail. Scholars at Oxford, Paris and Bologna could spend not just years, but decades working on a single text. The commentary tradition, where scholars wrote commentaries on the works of Aristotle or the Church Fathers, and then other scholars wrote commentaries on the commentaries, and then yet more scholars wrote commentaries on the commentaries on the commentaries, was essentially an institutionalized form of perseverative focus. You picked a text, you spent your life on it, you went deeper and deeper and deeper, layer after layer, and nobody thought this was strange because that was just what scholars did. In a world where most people could not read, the ability to sit in a room and focus on a single manuscript for 12 hours was not a disability, it was a superpower. The medieval university didn't just tolerate obsessive pattern-seeking minds, it actively recruited them. It gave them rooms and books and candles and said, go, think, write, and don't come out until you've produced something. The system was practically designed for the kind of person who could hyper-focus on a single subject, until they had exhausted every possible angle. But, and this is the but that Roger Bacon ran into face first, the system also had limits. You could be obsessive, but you had to be obsessive about the right things. You could spend decades on Aristotle, but you could not start suggesting that Aristotle was wrong. You could write commentary after commentary, but you could not write something genuinely new and expect the system to welcome it. The medieval university nurtured the obsessive mind, and then punished it the moment that mine produced something the institution was not prepared for. This is, if you think about it, a dynamic that has not changed, nearly as much as we like to pretend. We still build institutions that reward focused, detail-oriented, systematic thinking, and then act surprised and offended when the people doing that thinking arrive at conclusions that make everyone uncomfortable. We still celebrate the genius and then lock them up, metaphorically or literally, when the genius becomes inconvenient. Roger Bacon wrote about flying machines in the 13th century and was imprisoned for novelties, and if that is not one of the most perfectly medieval sentences ever constructed, I don't know what is. So you stand in Oxford, in the draughty halls, listening to the echo of a voice that has been silent for 7 centuries, and you think about what it means to have a mind that cannot stop, a mind that sees connections everywhere, that pursues knowledge not because it is useful, but because it is there, because the patterns demand to be followed, because the questions demand to be asked. You think about how the world has always needed these minds, and has always been slightly afraid of them, and then you step outside into the noise and chaos of a medieval town and you realise that the world Roger Bacon was trying to understand through optics and geometry and careful observation, that world is about to hit you with everything it has. Because here is what hits you first: the smell. You're standing at the edge of a market square on a Wednesday morning, and the air is so thick with competing odours that it feels almost solid, like you could lean against it. There is the sharp, acrid tang of the tanner's yard 2 streets over, where animal hides are being soaked in urine. Actual human and animal urine collected in buckets from households around town, because that is how you tan leather in the 13th century. And if you're feeling squeamish about this, I have some bad news about basically everything that follows. There is the heavy, sweet rotten smell of the fish stall directly to your left, where a woman is selling eels and herring, and something that might have been a pike 3 days ago, but is now mostly an argument about when food stops being food. There is the warm, yeasty breath of the bakery behind you, and the metallic bite of the blacksmith's forge, and the green, earthy stink of the dung heap at the corner, where 2 lanes meet, which is also where someone has decided to sell turnips, because medieval zoning laws are not really a thing. And the sounds. Oh, the sounds. The market square is a wall of noise. Merchants are shouting their wares at volumes that suggest they are trying to be heard, not just across the square, but across the county. A man with a cart full of pots is banging 2 of them together to attract attention, which is working, but not in the way he hopes, because the blacksmith next to him has taken this as a personal challenge and is now hammering with increased vigour. Somewhere a pig is screaming, not squealing. Screaming, the full-throated existential shriek of a pig that has correctly intuited what is about to happen to it. Children are running and yelling. Dogs are barking. And above it all, cutting through the chaos with the authority of something that answers to God and not to you, the church bells are ringing. The church bells. Let's talk about the church bells for a moment, because they are not background noise. They are the backbone of your entire existence. In a world without clocks, without watches, without phones, without any reliable personal timekeeping device, the church bells tell you when to wake up, when to pray, when to eat, when to work, when to stop working, and when to go to sleep. They ring for matins and lauds and prime and terce and sext and nun and vespers and compline, which means they ring roughly every 3 hours throughout the day and sometimes through the night as well. They ring for weddings and funerals and feast days and emergencies. They ring when someone important arrives in town. They ring when there is a fire. They are loud, they are bronze, they resonate through stone walls and wooden shutters, and directly into your skull, and there is absolutely no escaping them because they are literally the infrastructure of time itself. Now, take all of this. The smells, the sounds, the press of bodies in a narrow market lane, the visual chaos of hanging meat and piled vegetables and bolts of dyed cloth, and the occasional wandering goose, and imagine experiencing it with a nervous system that processes sensory input differently. Imagine being someone for whom the smell of the tannery is not just unpleasant but physically painful. Someone for whom the sound of the church bells is not just loud but overwhelming, a full-body experience that makes you want to press your hands over your ears and curl into yourself. Someone for whom the touch of rough wool against skin, and nearly everything is rough wool because this is medieval England and cotton is a luxury import and silk is for people who own castles, is a constant low-grade torture. Someone for whom the market square is not just busy but unbearable, a sensory assault that leaves you shaking and exhausted and unable to think. What do you do? Where do you go? Well, you have options. And this is where the medieval world gets interesting, because for all its noise and filth and chaos, it also had spaces of extraordinary quiet, and it had social roles that allowed people to inhabit those quiet spaces without anyone thinking they were particularly strange. You could become a monk, or a nun. The monastic life was structured around silence. Many orders practiced partial or total silence for most of the day. The daily routine was predictable, repetitive, and almost entirely unchanging. You woke at the same time, prayed at the same time, ate at the same time, worked at the same time, day after day after day for decades. The food was simple and consistent. The clothing was uniform. The physical environment was controlled. Stone walls, enclosed cloisters, gardens maintained in precise order. For someone who needed predictability, routine, and relief from sensory chaos, the monastery was not a punishment. It was a perfectly designed sensory regulation environment. And then there were the hermits. Medieval hermits were not the wild-eyed, cave-dwelling eccentrics of popular imagination, or rather some of them were, but many were officially sanctioned by the church, given a small cell or a hut on the edge of a town or in the middle of a forest, and essentially told, "Go live there and pray, and we will bring you food occasionally." The anchorites went even further. They were literally walled into small rooms attached to churches, with a window facing the altar and another window facing the street through which people could come and ask for spiritual advice. Julian of Norwich, whom we talked about earlier, lived like this for decades. You chose enclosure. You chose a tiny, controlled space with minimal sensory input. And the world not only let you do this, but actively respected you for it. Here is your quirky tidbit. There were so many hermits in medieval England that some of them were essentially employed as infrastructure. Hermits were sometimes given the job of maintaining bridges and roads, a solitary task that kept them away from towns but still useful to the community. Imagine that. You're a person who cannot bear the noise of the market, who needs to be alone, who finds peace in repetitive physical work. And medieval society says, "Perfect, here is a bridge. Keep it in good repair and pray for travellers, and we will make sure you have bread and ale." That is not exclusion. That is accommodation, medieval style. And then there were the shepherds, out on the hills, days and weeks alone with the sheep and the sky and the wind, performing the same tasks in the same rhythms through the turning of the seasons. The medieval landscape was full of these solitary roles. Charcoal burners in the forest, lighthouse keepers on the coast, watchers in the bell towers who had, ironically, to sit with the very bells that drove others to distraction. There were spaces in medieval society for people who needed to be alone, and those spaces were not considered shameful or strange. They were just where some people lived. But let's not romanticize this too much, because the flip side was also true. If you were a person with sensory sensitivities and you did not have access to these quiet roles, if you were a peasant farmer's wife in a one-room house with 6 children and a pig living under the same roof, if you were a servant in a busy household, if you were anyone who could not choose their environment, then your life was a relentless confrontation with sensory input that you had no way to escape and no language to describe. Think about the churches themselves. We think of medieval churches as places of peace and quiet contemplation, and sometimes they were, but they were also designed to be overwhelming sensory experiences. The incense was thick enough to taste. The chanting filled the stone space with resonant, overlapping vibrations. The stained glass threw coloured light across everything. The candlelight flickered across painted walls, because medieval churches were not the bare stone we see today. They were covered in vivid, sometimes lurid paintings of saints and demons, and the torments of hell. A medieval high mass was not a quiet, restrained affair. It was an immersive, total-body sensory event, and it was designed that way on purpose, because the church understood that overwhelming the senses was a way to create a feeling of transcendence. For some people, this worked exactly as intended. The sensory richness of the church was transporting, ecstatic, divine. For others, and here we circle back to our mystics, to our visionaries, to the people who saw and heard and felt things that others did not, the sensory intensity of the church was doing something quite different to their nervous systems. When Hildegard of Bingen described her visions as experiences of overwhelming light and sound, when Julian of Norwich described being consumed by divine sensation, it is worth asking whether the church itself, that extraordinary sensory engine of incense and chanting and candlelight, was triggering something in their neurology that the medieval world could only interpret as contact with God. Historians still argue whether the sensory design of medieval churches was primarily theological, meant to represent the glory of heaven, or primarily practical, meant to impress and control an illiterate population. It was probably both. But either way, it created environments of extraordinary sensory intensity, and the people who responded most dramatically to that intensity were often the ones who ended up being called saints. And so you stand in the market square and the noise washes over you, and you watch the people navigating this world. You watch the merchant who shouts the loudest and the customer who bargains the hardest, and the child who runs laughing through the legs of the crowd. And then you notice the other people, the ones at the edges, the one standing perfectly still in a doorway, hands pressed flat against the stone wall, eyes focused on something far away. The one who has pulled a hood over their head despite the mild weather. The one who is walking away from the market quickly and deliberately, toward the quiet of the churchyard or the open fields beyond the town walls. You notice them because you have been noticing them all night. The ones who are there but apart. The ones who found their own way through, and then you hear a sound that pulls your attention in a different direction entirely. It is small and sharp and distressed. It is the sound of a child crying, not the robust wailing of a tantrum, but the thin, keening cry of a child who's overwhelmed and cannot tell anyone why. You follow the sound through the market, past the fish stall and the potter's cart and the man who is still banging his pots together, down a side lane that narrows between timber-framed houses until you reach a doorway hung with a rough linen curtain, where inside it is dark and smoky. The fire in the centre of the room is burning green wood and the air is hazy. And there, in the corner on the packed earth floor, is a child. A boy, maybe 3 years old, maybe 4. It is hard to tell because he is small for his age, whatever his age is. He's not crying anymore. He's sitting very still, very focused, arranging pebbles in a line on the floor. Small, smooth pebbles, placing them with extraordinary precision, adjusting each one so the spacing is exactly even. The line must be perfectly straight. When his mother moves through the room and accidentally kicks one of the pebbles out of alignment, he screams. Not a cry, a scream. The kind that comes from somewhere so deep and so raw that it does not sound like a child at all. His mother picks up the pebble and puts it back, not exactly where it was, but close. He screams again. She tries again, placing it closer. He stops screaming. His mother stands there, looking down at him with an expression you recognise even across 7 centuries. A parent who loves their child completely and does not understand them at all. This is what being a different child looked like in the medieval world, a world that did not have a concept of childhood the way we do. The idea that children have different developmental stages is a relatively modern invention. Felipe Aries argued, controversially, that medieval people did not recognise childhood as a distinct phase of life. That is probably an overstatement. Medieval parents loved their children, mourned their deaths, worried about their futures. But the transition from child to small adult happened much earlier. By 7 years old, a child was expected to work, to contribute to the household, to begin learning a trade or helping in the fields, or attending a grammar school where they would be beaten for conjugating Latin verbs incorrectly. So what happened when a child could not do these things? When a child did not speak at 3 or 4 or 5? When they screamed at the touch of wool, a problem because wool was essentially the only fabric available? When a child could not learn to work the loom or follow instructions in the field, or play with other children without dissolving into distress? The answers varied, and they ranged from the compassionate to the horrifying, and sometimes both at once. Let's start with the changeling fear, one of the most widespread beliefs. Across medieval Europe, in England, Ireland, Germany, Scandinavia, and beyond, there was a belief that fairies or elves would steal a healthy human baby and leave behind a changeling. The changeling would look like the original child but behave differently. It might not speak or cry inconsolably, refuse to eat normally, be unusually still or agitated, or stare without focusing. If you are reading that list and thinking it sounds like a description of autism spectrum traits in a very young child, you're not the first person to notice this. Several scholars have pointed out that the changeling myth maps with uncomfortable precision onto the experience of parents whose children showed signs of developmental difference. The child seemed normal for a while, and then stopped developing as expected. They stopped speaking, or never started. They became withdrawn, or overwhelmed, or rigidly focused on specific objects. The parents had no framework for understanding neurological variation, so they reached for the only explanation available. This is not our child. Our child was taken. And here is where it gets dark, because the folk remedies for changelings were not gentle. In some traditions, the changeling was placed on a hot shovel or held over a fire, or the changeling was to be left outside overnight in the cold, because the theory was that the fairies would hear its distress and return the real child. There are records, just scattered, fragmentary but real, of children being harmed or killed because their parents or communities believed them to be changelings. In 1826, astonishingly late for this kind of thing, a woman in Ireland was tried for drowning her child after being told by a fairy doctor that it was a changeling. But here is the thing that is easy to miss in the horror of these stories. The changeling belief also contained within it a kind of compassion. What the parents were saying in their own terrible way was, "This child is not ours," which also meant our real child is out there somewhere, healthy and whole. The changeling myth allowed parents to separate their grief and confusion from their love for the child they had expected. It was a coping mechanism, a brutal one, yes, but it was a way of making sense of something that made no sense in a world without developmental psychology. And not every family reached for the supernatural explanation. Many parents did something much simpler and more recognisable. They took their child to the local holy well, brought them to church for a blessing, and prayed. They lit candles, they went on pilgrimages, sometimes travelling for days or weeks with a child who could not tolerate travel, to reach a shrine associated with healing miracles. And when the miracles did not come, when the child did not suddenly begin speaking after being dipped in the holy water at the shrine, when the saint's relic did not cure the silence or the screaming, many of them simply adapted. Here is a historical fact that is easy to overlook. Many medieval families just coped. The child who did not speak was given tasks that did not require speech. The child who could not tolerate the noise of the market was kept at home. Given work in the garden, set to tending animals, the child who arranged pebbles in perfect rows was handed a broom and learned to sweep. And if they swept the same patch of floor 17 times in exactly the same pattern, well, at least the floor was clean. Historians still argue whether medieval families were more or less accepting of disability than modern ones, because the evidence is so fragmentary and coloured by the biases of those who wrote it down. Those who wrote the records were overwhelmingly literate churchmen, not illiterate peasant parents. The daily reality of how families actually lived with difference is mostly lost to us. It survives only in fragments and hints and the occasional heartbreaking detail in a church record, records written as evidence of affliction needing miraculous intervention. Here is your quirky tidbit for this section. Medieval miracle records, the official accounts kept by churches to document miracles attributed to saints, sometimes include incredibly detailed descriptions of children's behaviours. Parents would bring their children to shrines and describe exactly what was wrong with them, hoping for a cure, and the monks would write it all down. A child who speaks not and knows no one. A child who cannot bear to be touched. A child who sits apart and will not play. But read with modern eyes, they are also some of the most vivid descriptions we have of what we would now recognise as developmental difference in medieval children. They are parents' voices, filtered through monks' quills, describing their children with the desperate specificity of people who have been watching and worrying and hoping and not understanding. And sometimes the miracle records note that the child was cured, that after the visit to the shrine the child spoke or played or recognised their parents. And sometimes the records note more quietly that the child was brought home unchanged. And you imagine that walk home, the parents carrying the child who is still silent, still overwhelmed, still different, back through the lanes and fields to the house where they will continue to love this child and not understand them and keep going. The boy with the pebbles is still arranging them. His line is longer now, stretching across the floor of the house, and you notice that he has sorted them by colour. Grey, then brown, then white, then grey again, in a pattern that repeats. His mother has stopped trying to move through the room without disturbing them. She's sitting on a bench by the wall, mending something, watching him with that expression that is not quite worry and not quite peace, but something in between, that every parent of a different child throughout all of history would recognise instantly. You leave them there and step back into the lane, into the noise. And you think about how the story of medieval disability is not one story, but thousands of stories, most of them unrecorded, most of them lost. Each one as specific and complicated and human as a line of pebbles arranged on a dirt floor by a child who cannot tell you why the pattern matters, only that it does. And as you walk, you find yourself thinking about the people in this story who are hardest to see. Not the monks and scholars and mystics, those at least left records. No, you're thinking about the women. Because in a world where women were expected to be silent, obedient and domestic, how would you ever know if a woman was neurodivergent? How would you tell the difference between a good wife and a woman whose brain simply worked differently? The answer you suspect is that in most cases you wouldn't. You're standing in the yard behind a manor house watching women work. It is morning, early enough that the light is still thin and grey. The women are already busy because the women are always already busy. One is spinning wool, the drop spindle turning in a rhythm so steady and repetitive that it looks almost hypnotic. Another is kneading bread, her hands pressing and folding and pressing and folding in the same motion, over and over. A third is feeding chickens, scattering grain in precise handfuls. She counts the birds with a quick, practiced eye. These are the rhythms of medieval women's work, almost entirely composed of repetitive, pattern-based sensory-specific tasks. Spinning, weaving, kneading, brewing, churning butter, carding wool, picking through grain to remove stones and chaff, plucking feathers, stitching seams. These are tasks that reward consistency, patience, and relentless focus. They are tasks that can be performed in relative quiet, in the company of other women who are also working and who do not necessarily require conversation. They are tasks with a clear, tangible, satisfying result, a thread, a loaf, a bolt of cloth, and a woman could perform them all her life without anyone noticing. This is the invisibility problem, and it is enormous. Think about what the medieval world expected from women: silence, obedience, domestic competence, modesty. A woman was not supposed to speak much in public. She was not supposed to make eye contact with men who were not her husband. She was not supposed to voice her opinions. She was supposed to stay near the home, performing domestic tasks, raising her children, and being, in general, as unobtrusive as possible. The ideal medieval wife, according to conduct books written by men, was quiet, diligent, focused, and content with routine. A description that raises a very pointed question. How would you distinguish an ideally behaved medieval wife from a woman on the autism spectrum? You would not. That is the point. A woman who did not make eye contact was modest. A woman who did not speak much in public was well-mannered. A woman who preferred the same routine every day was reliable. A woman who found deep satisfaction in the repetitive patterns of spinning or weaving was simply good at her job. Every trait that might flag her as neurodivergent was exactly what society demanded. The mask was the expectation. You did not have to learn to camouflage because the camouflage was already the dress code itself. For every Roger Bacon who stood out because his different mind produced different ideas, there were hundreds of women whose different minds were invisible, hidden behind perfect domestic compliance. They spun wool and kneaded bread and kept their eyes down and mouths shut. The historical record remembers them, if at all, as good wives and dutiful daughters and nothing more. They are the dark matter of neurodivergent history. Their presence can be inferred from the shape of things around them, but they themselves are invisible. Medical texts from the medieval period rarely discussed women's mental states at all, and when they did, the language was almost entirely about reproductive health. Women's behavioural differences were attributed to the wandering womb theory, inherited from classical medicine, holding that women's psychological troubles were caused by the uterus literally moving inside the body. If a woman was anxious, it was her womb. If she was depressed, it was her womb. If she behaved strangely, it was her womb. The brain was not on the table. But there were exceptions, and the most extraordinary is a woman named Margery Kempe, who was about to walk into our story and make a tremendous amount of noise. Margery Kempe was born around 1373 in Bishop's Lynn, Norfolk. She was the daughter of a prosperous merchant and town mayor, and from the very beginning of her story she is a lot. She married John Kempe at around age 20 and quickly had the first of 14 children. After the birth of her first child, she experienced a devastating mental crisis. Visions of demons, terror, despair, a complete breakdown that lasted months. She recovered after a vision of Christ sitting on her bed, telling her to return to the world. And then she spent the rest of her life weeping. Not occasionally, not quietly, Margery Kempe wept loudly, publicly, uncontrollably, at the slightest provocation. She wept in churches and in the streets, during sermons, during meals, during conversations. She wept so loudly and so persistently that she became famous for it, and not in a good way. Her crying was boisterous weeping, Great, heaving, gasping sobs she could not control and could not stop. A physical compulsion that came without warning and left her trembling. She also had visions, intense, detailed, vivid visions of Christ, the Virgin Mary, saints and angels, conversing with divine figures with the familiarity of talking to a neighbour. She heard divine voices telling her to go on pilgrimages, and she went. She travelled to Jerusalem, Rome, Santiago de Compostela, and Germany with relentless determination. She was a woman told by God to go and would not let distance, expense, danger, or the unanimous disapproval of everyone around her stand in the way. The thing about Margery Kemp is that she annoyed everyone. She annoyed her husband, who agreed to a vow of chastity partly because he was exhausted. She annoyed the clergy, who could not decide if her visions were divine or diabolical. She annoyed her fellow pilgrims so thoroughly and consistently that they literally abandoned her. On her pilgrimage to Jerusalem, her companions got so fed up with her constant weeping and God talk at every meal that they told her they would not travel with her anymore. They left her, in a foreign country, in the 14th century, when travelling alone as a woman was genuinely dangerous. They left her because they could not stand her for one more day. Margery Kemp's response to being abandoned was to keep going, alone, because stopping was not something that occurred to her. God had told her to go, and she was going. She dictated what is recognised as the first autobiography in the English language, the Book of Margery Kemp, to scribes, in extraordinary and sometimes exhausting detail. That book is vivid and baffling. A woman who could not stop crying, could not stop describing visions, and could not understand why everyone kept getting so upset about it. She could not read social cues or adjust her behaviour to match expectations. She could not understand why everyone kept getting so upset about it. Historians still argue whether Margery Kemp was a genuine mystic, a mentally ill woman, or an extraordinarily difficult personality, with modern suggestions of bipolar disorder, temporal lobe epilepsy, or autism. The uncontrollable weeping could be emotional dysregulation. The intense, focused visions could be hyper-focused inner experience. These are patterns that recur across centuries and diagnostic categories. The inability to modulate behaviour for social context, the rigid insistence on following pilgrimages regardless of personal cost. These are patterns we have seen before, in other faces, across other centuries. Here is the quirky tidbit. Margery Kempe was put on trial for heresy multiple times, and she talked her way out of it every single time. For a woman who supposedly could not read social cues, she was remarkably skilled at defending herself in formal settings, quoting scripture and arguing theology with focused intensity. She excelled in structured situations with clear rules and defined expectations, while being completely at sea in the unstructured social world of everyday interaction. If that sounds familiar, it should, because it's a pattern that modern clinicians see constantly in their offices 800 years later. What Margery Kemp had that most medieval women did not was a voice. Her mysticism gave her permission to speak, an authority that overrode the expectation of female silence. Mysticism gave her a framework in which her differences were not flaws but gifts, not signs of madness but signs of holiness, the one door in the wall of silence. The one role that let a woman be loud, intense, and different, and be respected, or at least tolerated, which in the medieval world amounted to very much the same thing. But for every Margery Kemp, there were thousands of women for whom no such door existed. Women who spun their wool in silence and never told anyone about the patterns they saw, or the sounds that overwhelmed them, or the way the world felt too loud and too bright. Women who were good wives, who were invisible, whose different minds are lost to us completely. You think about them as you walk away from the manor house. The spinners and weavers and bakers, hands moving in endless repetitive rhythms, eyes focused on their work, mouths closed. You will never know their names, but you know they were there. And now, as the light changes and the day tilts toward evening, you hear something rising above the rooftops. Not church bells this time, not screaming pigs or shouting merchants. This is wild, unrestrained, slightly unhinged laughter, and music, drums and pipes and a hurdy-gurdy, rising from somewhere near. There is a festival happening just around that corner. You hear the drums and the pipes and the laughter, and you're walking straight toward it. The street is full of people wearing their clothes backward. That is the first thing you notice, and it sets the tone for everything that follows. A man in priest's vestments, worn inside out, bears a donkey's head of painted wood and papier-mâché, solemnly blessing the crowd with a sausage. A boy of maybe 10 perches on the tallest man's shoulders, wearing a paper crown and waving a ribbon-wrapped stick as if it were a royal sceptre. Young men are singing a hymn with all sacred words replaced by the names of cheeses, with the earnest conviction of a cathedral choir performing for the Pope himself. Welcome to the Feast of Fools, the one day of the medieval year when nothing means what it's supposed to mean, when the bottom is the top. When the lowest become the highest, and the rules governing every other day of your life are suspended with the full, grudging, complicated permission of the very authorities whose rules they are. The Feast of Fools was celebrated across medieval Europe, particularly France and England, around the Feast of Holy Innocents in late December or the Feast of the Circumcision on January 1st. The timing mattered. This was the dead of winter, the darkest part of the year, the season when days were short and people desperately needed to laugh. The subdeacons, the lowest-ranking cathedral clergy, elected a lord of misrule or a boy bishop who would preside over a mock religious service. The service parodied the Mass, praying substituted for proper responses, dice rolled on the altar, and incense replaced with the smoke of old shoes burned in a censer. The congregation howled. The clergy, at least the younger clergy, howled louder, and out in the streets the great inversion spread to everything. Servants gave orders to masters, men dressed as women and women dressed as men. The entire social fabric turned cheerfully and deliberately inside out for a day. The town fool, a recognised figure whose social role was to be ridiculous, was crowned as king and paraded through the streets on a cart dispensing mock justice. The normal categories of behaviour, dignified and undignified, sacred and profane, wise and foolish, were not just blurred but deliberately exuberantly smashed. Some church authorities tolerated the Feast of Fools as a release valve. Let people go wild for one day, and they would be more obedient for the other 364. Others condemned it furiously. A letter from the Paris Faculty of Theology in 1445 denounced the celebrations as scandalous, and various synods tried to ban them across the centuries. The feast persisted anyway, because telling medieval people they were not allowed to have fun turned out to be about as effective as telling the tide not to come in. The Feast of Fools was not just a party, it was a philosophy. At its heart, the categories by which we organise the world are not fixed. They are conventions, they are agreements. And once a year you could demonstrate this by turning everything upside down and showing that the world did not end, that the sun still rose the next morning, that the categories were real only because everyone agreed to act as if they were, a profoundly radical idea with everything to do with how society dealt with difference. Because the fool, the figure at the centre of the feast, the one who wore the crown and sat on the donkey and dispensed mock wisdom, the fool was not nothing. The fool was a recognised social role, a position in the medieval hierarchy simultaneously the lowest and in certain crucial ways the highest. The fool could speak truth to power, mock the mighty, point out the emperor's lack of clothes, because the fool was already understood to stand outside normal rules entirely. The fool's words did not count officially, which meant the fool's words could be more honest than anyone else's. Medieval courts employed professional fools whose job was to make the king laugh, but also to tell the king things no courtier dared say, that the king was fat, his decisions foolish, the war pointless, and the taxes ruinously high. The king could not punish the fool, because to punish a fool for foolishness would be to admit that the foolish things were actually true. Some people occupied the fool's role by choice, others because the world decided they belonged there. A person who behaved strangely might be absorbed into the role of the natural fool, the fool who was foolish not by art but by nature. And this role was, in its complicated way, a form of protection. The natural fool was fed and housed by the community. The natural fool was allowed to be different, as long as the difference stayed entertaining, or at least tolerable, and as long as the fool stayed in the role the community had assigned. The fool was allowed to speak, but only because no one took the fool's words seriously. The protection came at a price, and the price was dignity. To be the fool was to be the person everyone laughed at, the person whose feelings did not quite count, who existed for the entertainment and reassurance of others. The laughter at the fool was sometimes affectionate, it was also sometimes cruel, and the line between the two was often invisible to everyone except the fool himself. The Feast of Fools, the broader tradition of carnival, and was a built-in pressure valve for a rigidly hierarchical society, deeply invested in the idea that everyone had their place. And one thing that pressure valve did was create a temporary space where difference was not just tolerated but celebrated. For one day, being strange was an asset, not a liability. For one day, the person who did not fit in was the person who fit in the most, because not fitting in was the entire point of the celebration. Historians still argue whether festivals like the Feast of Fools genuinely empowered marginalised people, or simply reinforced their marginalisation by containing their difference within a safely bounded ritual space. Were these festivals moments of genuine liberation, when the social order was questioned and the lowly truly elevated, or safety valves that simply let off steam without changing anything? The answer, as with most things medieval, is probably both. The festival gave the fool a crown and a day of glory, then the next morning took it all away again. Everyone went back to their proper places, and the fool was just the fool again. But something lingered. Something always lingered after a day like that. Because you cannot spend a day watching the fool wear the crown without starting to wonder, even if only in the back of your mind, whether the fool might actually deserve it. You cannot laugh at the world turned upside down without noticing it has its own logic, or sing hymns with cheese names without realising the original hymns are also a performance. Words we agree to say because everyone else says them. And here is your quirky tidbit. The Feast of Fools was not the only medieval celebration that inverted the social order. There was the boy bishop tradition, where a choir boy was elected as bishop for a day and presided over actual church services, with the congregation obligingly treating him as the real thing. And there was Hocktide, an English festival where on one day the women captured the men and held them for ransom, and the next day the men captured the women. And there was the Charivari, a raucous mocking procession targeting people who had violated social norms, like a husband beaten by his wife, or a widow who remarried too quickly. Medieval society was full of these moments of license disorder, these carefully controlled eruptions of chaos, suggesting something important about how that society understood the relationship between order and disorder, between the normal and the abnormal, between the way things were supposed to be and the way they actually were. The medieval world knew its categories were fragile. The line between the wise man and the fool was thinner than anyone admitted. The person at the bottom might see things more clearly than the person at the very top. The Feast of Fools was the one day this knowledge could surface, dance in the streets, wear a paper crown and a donkey's head and simply say, "Look at me. Look at us. Look at us. Look at how thin the line is between what you call normal and what you call foolish," and wonder, just for a moment, which side you are really on. The music is fading now. The drums are slowing. The man with the donkey head sits on a barrel eating a meat pie, and the boy has fallen asleep in his mother's arms. The ribbon-wrapped stick still clutched in his small hand. The street is littered with turnip pieces and trampled flowers, and the particular debris of a celebration that has burned itself out. Tomorrow the church bells will ring, the market will open, the normal order will reassert itself, the fool will return to being the fool, the different will return to being different. And the world will pretend, as it always pretends, that the categories are fixed and real and permanent. But you know better now, having walked through this long night. You have spent the night meeting mystics and monks and scholars and silent women and screaming children and dancing fools, and you know that these categories have always been leaky, always contested, always more complicated than the people enforcing them wanted to admit. The medieval world did not have a word for autism, no diagnosis, no spectrum, no clinical criteria. But it had the people. It always had the people. Those different, difficult, brilliant, struggling, extraordinary people. They were here. They were always here. Arranging pebbles on dirt floors, writing about flying machines in stone cells, weeping in churches, dancing in the streets on the one day the world admitted the fools had been right all along. The music stops. The night is quiet, the street is empty, the torches are dark, and the long, strange night of misrule has finally gently come to its end. And you keep walking. And just like that, the music stops. Not all at once, of course. History doesn't work like that. There's no single morning when Europe wakes up and decides to be cruel instead of complicated. But you can feel it happening if you know where to look, this slow tightening, this narrowing, of the space where difference was allowed to exist. The Feast of Fools fades. The holy fools lose their protection. The village eccentric stops being eccentric and starts being a problem. And you, standing at the hinge point between the medieval and the early modern, can feel the temperature dropping. It starts with theology, because in Europe everything starts with theology. The Reformation cracks the Catholic world in half during the 16th century. And whatever you think about Martin Luther nailing his theses to that church door in Wittenberg in 1517, the consequences for different people were devastating. Historians still argue whether he actually nailed anything or just mailed a politely angry letter. But the consequences were not immediate, and not everywhere. But the Reformation rewired how European society thought about the human soul, about demons, about who was saved and who was damned. And those rewirings had consequences that rippled outward for centuries. Here's what you need to understand about medieval Catholicism and human difference. Medieval Catholicism, for all its problems, had created a surprisingly elastic framework for human difference. You could be a mystic having visions and be called holy. You could be a hermit who never spoke to anyone, and the church might call you devout. You could be a monk copying the same manuscript. For 40 years, never looking anyone in the eye, and the church might call you dedicated. The system had categories for absorbing neurodivergence and giving it meaning. Saint, mystic, anchorite, holy fool. These categories were not always for everyone, but they existed, and the Reformation burned those categories down. Luther and the other reformers were deeply suspicious of mysticism, of visions, of the whole elaborate Catholic apparatus of saints and divine madness. They wanted scripture. They wanted reason. They wanted clear doctrine and correct belief. And if you couldn't demonstrate correct belief, something was wrong with you. If you couldn't articulate your faith in the right words, in the right way, at the right time, then something was damnably wrong with you. You're watching this happen in real time, and it's like watching someone drain a lake. All those little ecological niches where unusual people survived are drying up. These monasteries and hermitages and pilgrimage roads and cathedral scriptoriums, they're drying up. The monasteries dissolve in England under Henry VIII. The hermits lose their patrons, the holy fools lose their theological justification, and the people who fill those roles don't disappear. They never disappear. But the places that sheltered them do disappear. And then there's Martin Luther himself, and this is where the story gets genuinely dark. So settle in and brace yourself a little. In the 1540s, Luther encountered a 12-year-old boy in Dessau who was profoundly disabled. He may have been nonverbal. He may have had what we would now recognise as severe autism or intellectual disability, or both. The historical record doesn't give us a clean diagnosis, and honestly, it doesn't matter. What Luther said about this child tells you everything about the shifting winds. Luther declared the boy a changeling, not metaphorically, not poetically, literally. He said the child had no soul, that the devil had placed it there, and that the boy should be taken to the river and drowned. Let that sit for a moment. This is Martin Luther, the father of the Reformation, one of the most influential thinkers in Western history, a man whose words shaped the beliefs of millions. And he looked at a disabled child and said, "Drown him." Now, historians still argue whether Luther's advice was actually carried out. The evidence is murky. Some accounts suggest the boy died shortly after Luther's visit. Others suggest he lived on. What's not arguable is the theology behind the statement, the absolute conviction that a child who behaved differently was not fully human, who couldn't speak or interact in expected ways, who existed outside the narrow band of normal human behaviour, was a trick of the devil, was soulless. This wasn't a fringe belief. This was the most famous theologian in Protestant Europe giving his official opinion, and it landed in a culture already primed for this thinking. Because the 16th and 17th centuries were the golden age of witch trials, and the witch trials were, among many other terrible things, a catastrophe for the different. You've heard of witch trials, obviously. You probably picture Salem in 1692 because American cultural memory is powerful and slightly narcissistic. But Salem was a late echo. The real engine of witch persecution ran through Europe from roughly 1450 to 1750, killing tens of thousands. The vast majority of them were women. The numbers are disputed. Everything about witch trials is disputed, but the scale is certainly not. And here's the thing that matters for our story. When you read the trial records, when you look at who was actually accused of witchcraft, a pattern emerges. That will make your stomach turn. The accused were disproportionately people who were socially isolated, people who behaved oddly, people who talked to themselves or didn't talk, people who had unusual habits or strange fixations, people who didn't maintain normal social relationships, people described in terms that sound hauntingly familiar. If you know anything at all about neurodivergence, the old woman who lived alone and muttered to herself and kept too many cats, the midwife whose manner was off-putting and who didn't show the right emotions at the right times, the herbalist who knew too much about plants, and not enough about pleasantries, the man, yes, men too, though less often, who was too solitary, too strange, too absorbed in his own world. Were all of these people autistic? Of course not. Were some of them? Almost certainly. And the system that had once found a place for them was collapsing. The early modern period brought centralisation. It brought state power, it brought institutions, and institutions need categories, and categories need boundaries, and boundaries create outsiders. The village that once absorbed its odd members into the fabric of daily life was being replaced by a society that sorted people into boxes. Productive citizen, dangerous deviant, charitable case. And if you didn't fit neatly into the first box, the other two were waiting for you. This is a joke you can't laugh at. The Renaissance, that great flowering of human potential, that celebration of individual genius, was also getting worse at tolerating difference. People who were genuinely uncomfortably individual, Leonardo da Vinci, sure, the world loves a genius, but the genius has to be legible. The genius has to produce paintings and inventions and notebooks that future generations can auction. The quiet monk, the mystic, the holy fool, these were not the right kind. These were the kind of individual that the New World was learning to fear. You stand at the border between two ages and can feel the gate closing behind you. The medieval world wasn't kind exactly, but it was spacious in ways that the early modern world was not. It had room for strangeness. It had theology that could frame difference as divine. It had communities small enough that everyone knew the odd ones and kept them fed and sheltered. And part of things, that space is closing now, the witch trials are burning, Luther is pronouncing judgment, the monasteries are emptying, and the people who lived in the cracks of the old world are about to find that the new world has sealed those cracks shut, and painted over them with something that looks like progress but feels, if you're on the wrong side of it, like a trap. Sleep isn't coming for this section. Not yet. There's too much darkness still settling over the world like a heavy woolen blanket. You're moving forward now, past the witch trials, past the Reformation, past the Enlightenment with its confident talk of reason and progress. And you're arriving in a place that should feel safe. Ireland, 1895. The Victorian era. Electricity exists. Trains exist. The germ theory of disease exists. Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species 36 years ago. This is the modern world, or close enough that you can smell the gasworks. Or close enough that you can smell the gasworks and hear the telegraph clicking. And in a small cottage in Ballyvadlia, County Tipperary, something terrible is happening. A man named Michael Cleary is holding his wife down and forcing herbal potions between her teeth, because he believes the fairies have taken her. He believes this truly, deeply, with every fibre of his being. In his mind, the woman in that bed is not his wife at all. Remember Bridget? We started this whole journey with her, hours ago, when you first settled in and the candles were still tall. She was the question that opened the door. Now you're going to hear the rest of her story, and it is not gentle. But you need to hear it because it's the proof that changeling belief wasn't a quaint medieval superstition. It was real, and it was powerful. And it was deadly all the way into the age of the steam engine. Bridget Cleary was 26 years old and an unusual woman for her time. She was a dressmaker. She had her own income, which was rare for a rural Irish woman in the 1890s. She was literate and independent. She was described as attractive and a little bit sharp, the kind of woman who didn't always say what people expected her to say. She and Michael had been married for several years. They had no children, which was itself unusual, and, in their community's eyes, slightly suspicious. In early March of 1895, Bridget fell ill. It may have been bronchitis or perhaps pneumonia. The doctor was called, but only eventually. But Michael Cleary was already thinking along older lines. Bridget wasn't acting like herself. She was bedridden, feverish, and saying strange things. And somewhere deep in Michael's mind, a very old story started playing. She's not Bridget. She's been taken. The fairies have her now. And this thing in the bed is what they left behind. What happened next took 9 days, and it involved not just Michael, but many others. A collection of relatives and neighbours, 7 other people who would eventually stand trial, and a local herb doctor named Dennis Gainey were all involved. Dennis Gainey prescribed remedies involving herbs and fire that had nothing to do with the 19th century, and everything to do with the 15th. They forced Bridget to drink herbal concoctions. They held her over the fireplace. They carried her to the fire and demanded she answer them. They demanded that she answer in the name of God, whether she was Bridget Cleary or not. This is the question that echoed through history. This is the question that became a nursery rhyme, because Ireland processes its horrors through song the way other cultures process them through therapy. Are you a witch? Or are you a fairy? Or are you the wife of Michael Cleary? Children sang this in schoolyards within months of Bridget's death. They were still singing it decades later. There's something about the rhythm that sticks in your mouth like a burr, catchy and terrible and impossible to unhear. On the night of March 15th, 1895, Michael Cleary held Bridget down in front of the kitchen fire. He had stripped her of her night clothes. He had already doused her with paraffin oil. And then, because she could not answer his questions in the way that would prove she was real, he set her on fire. She died. He buried her body in a shallow grave in a nearby field, covering it with branches, and then he waited at a local fairy fort. A ring fort, one of those ancient earthen mounds that dot the Irish countryside. He believed the real Bridget would appear there, riding a white horse. He believed he could cut her free from the fairy procession and bring her home, but the real Bridget was dead in a ditch, covered with branches. The body was found within days. Michael Cleary and 8 others were arrested. The trial was a sensation, covered by newspapers across Britain and Ireland. It was 1895. Queen Victoria was on the throne. Oscar Wilde was on trial in London at almost exactly the same time. The Lumiere brothers were about to screen the first motion pictures, and in a Tipperary courtroom, a man was explaining that he burned his wife because the fairies took her. Michael Cleary was convicted of manslaughter, not murder, and sentenced to 20 years of hard labour. He served 15 years of that sentence. The others received lesser sentences. The case became a flashpoint in the ongoing debate about Irish identity, about whether Ireland was a modern nation or a backward one. Was fairy belief charming folklore or dangerous superstition? English newspapers used the case to argue that the Irish were primitive and uncivilized. Irish nationalists were mortified. Everyone had an opinion about the case, but nobody, no matter what they believed, could bring Bridget back. Historians still argue whether the Cleary case was really about fairy belief or about something else entirely. Perhaps a bad marriage or suspicion of an affair. Perhaps the fairy story provided convenient cover for domestic murder. The evidence supports multiple readings of what truly happened that night in Tipperary. What's not arguable is that the other participants, the neighbours and relatives who held Bridget down and poured potions into her, truly believed what they were doing. They weren't performing for an audience, they were terrified. They genuinely thought they were fighting the fairies for a woman's immortal soul. And here's the thing that connects Bridget Cleary back to everything you've been listening to tonight. The changeling belief that killed her was the very same belief. The same belief that had shaped how European communities understood difference for 1,000 years. The same belief that once led a medieval mother to abandon her child. She left her unusual child at a fairy mound overnight, hoping the real child would be returned. The same belief that Luther invoked when he called a disabled boy soulless. The same belief that whispered in the background of witch trials, that hummed beneath the surface of village life for centuries across all of Europe. A framework, terrible and beautiful and dangerous, for understanding why some people were simply not like others. Bridget Cleary wasn't autistic as far as anyone knows. She was sick, but the framework that killed her was the same framework that had been applied to autistic people, to people with intellectual disabilities, to people with schizophrenia or epilepsy or any condition that made them behave in ways their community couldn't explain. The changeling story was a universal solvent for human difference, and it could dissolve anyone. The long shadow of the changeling stretched well beyond Bridget, deep into the 20th century and far across the British Isles. In rural Ireland and Scotland, fairy belief persisted deep into the 20th century. Folklorists collecting stories in the 1930s and 40s found people who absolutely believed. They could tell you about changelings they had known personally, and they maintained that certain neighbours or relatives had been taken and replaced by the fairies. This wasn't nostalgia. This wasn't performance for the visiting academic with the tape recorder. This was lived belief, as real and as structuring as any religion. The last documented changeling accusation in the British Isles is hard to pin down exactly, because these things happened quietly and locally in small communities. Nobody called the newspapers, but anecdotal accounts persist into the 1960s and even later. The belief didn't die, it just went underground. It became something people whispered about rather than acted on. A story you told about the past rather than a diagnosis you applied in the present. But the residue remained. In rural communities across Ireland and Scotland, there were people who carried the shadow of the changeling label their whole lives. The child who didn't develop on time, the adult who never married, never quite fit in, who lived with elderly parents and was spoken about in careful euphemisms. He's away with the fairies became a common Irish-English expression for someone who's distracted or not quite present, and it carries inside it something ancient. Like a fossil in amber, that phrase carries 1,000 years of genuine belief that some people were literally not human. Think about that weight inside common words. You lie in the dark and think about Bridget Cleary, and you think about that 12-year-old boy in Dessau whom Luther condemned so long ago. And you think about every person across every century who was looked at by their community and found to be somehow wrong, somehow other, somehow not quite right. And you realise that the Changeling story was never really about fairies. It was about the terrifying human inability to tolerate difference without a story to explain it. The story has been told, the fire has been lit, the fire has gone out, Bridget is gone. But the question she was asked remains alive. Are you yourself, or are you something else? That question is still being asked in different words in different rooms every single day. You sit in a quieter room now. The fire is out. The medieval world has receded, and you find yourself in something that looks like the present. There's a book in your hands, an actual modern book with a glossy cover, and a barcode on the back and blurbs from reviewers who call it essential. The book is about autism, and you're reading it with different eyes because you've walked through 1,000 years of history and seen the people inside it. You know something that the book can only gesture at. They were always there. The clinical story starts in 1943 in a medical journal. Leo Kanner, an Austrian-American psychiatrist at Johns Hopkins University, published a paper describing 11 children who shared a cluster of unusual traits. They had, as Kanner described, an innate inability to form the usual effective contact with people. They preferred sameness and were disturbed by changes in routine. They had remarkable memories. Some had extraordinary abilities in specific areas. Some didn't speak. Others spoke in unusual ways, echoing phrases or referring to themselves in third person. Kanner called the condition early infantile autism, borrowing the word from the Swiss psychiatrist Eugene Bleuler, who had coined it decades earlier to describe self-absorbed withdrawal. Kanner was describing something different, and he was clear about that. But the word stuck. Autism. From the Greek autos meaning self, a condition defined, from its very first naming, by the relationship between the self and the world. 1 year later, in 1944, something parallel emerged. An Austrian paediatrician named Hans Asperger published his own paper describing children with similar traits, though his subjects were generally more verbal and more conventionally intellectual. Asperger called them his little professors because of their intense focused interests and their tendency to lecture adults on their favourite topics with great enthusiasm. He wrote about them with warmth that is sometimes genuine, sometimes patronising, and sometimes both at once, which is a very Austrian combination, honestly. Asperger's paper, written in German, went largely unnoticed in the English-speaking world for decades. It wasn't until the 1980s and 90s that his work was translated. This led to the concept of Asperger's syndrome as a distinct diagnosis, which has since been folded back into the broader autism spectrum we recognise today. Asperger's name lingers in popular imagination, but his legacy is complicated by his involvement with the Nazi regime in Vienna during the darkest years of Europe. Historians still argue whether Asperger was protecting his patients from Nazi eugenics programs or cooperating with them. The evidence supports more than one reading. But here's the thing. You're sitting with this book, reading about Kanner's observations and Asperger's little professors, and you're thinking, I've met these people before. Not in a clinic, not in a journal article, in a medieval monastery. Brother Thomas bent over his manuscript, copying the same text for the 1,000th time, perfectly content. Wasn't that an intense, focused interest? Wasn't that a preference for sameness, for routine, for the predictable rhythm of ink on parchment day after day? His inability to make small talk with the other monks, his tendency to miss social cues that everyone else navigated effortlessly. Wasn't that what Kanner described centuries later? Hildegard of Bingen, with her overwhelming sensory experiences, her visions of light and sound that no one else could see, her compulsive need to document everything she encountered, the music, the medicine, the theology, the natural world. Wasn't that what Asperger described when he spoke of children who became absolute experts in their fascinations? Julian of Norwich, sealed in her anchor-hold for decades, choosing radical solitude not as punishment but as the condition under which her mind worked best. She produced some of the most profound theological writing in English from a room the size of a parking space. Doesn't that sound like someone who thrived in a low-stimulus environment? The anonymous craftsman who spent years carving a single cathedral doorway, who could see the grain of stone the way other people see faces. They lived inside their work so completely that the distinction between maker and the made dissolved. These are the people researchers describe when they talk about monotropism, the tendency to pour all attention into a single channel until it becomes almost supernaturally deep. You're not diagnosing anyone. You can't diagnose anyone. These people have been dead for centuries, and you don't have their medical histories. Applying 21st century diagnostic categories to medieval people is an exercise in anachronism. That would make any serious historian reach for a stiff drink. You know this, and yet the resemblances are so striking that they demand to be noticed. Not because it matters whether Hildegard would have met the diagnostic criteria for autism spectrum disorder. It doesn't matter, not really. But noticing changes how you think. Noticing the resemblances changes how you think about autism itself. It stops being a modern condition, a product of modern life, a consequence of current panics. It starts being what it actually is, a way of being human that has existed for as long as humans have existed, taking different forms in different cultures throughout all of history, interpreted through whatever framework was available: fairy changeling, divine mystic, demonic possession, medical diagnosis, but never, ever not been there. The monks who loved routine were there in the 6th century when Benedict wrote his rule. They were there in the 12th, when Cistercian abbeys spread across Europe. They were there in the 15th century when the printing press started to make their copying work obsolete. They didn't stop existing when the diagnosis was invented. They existed before the diagnosis, during it and after it, and they'll exist long after the current manuals have been replaced by whatever comes next in the future. The scholars who couldn't stop studying were there in 9th century Baghdad and 12th century Paris and 15th century Florence, accumulating knowledge with insatiable hunger. That hunger looked obsessive to some and inspired to others, and it was probably honestly both. The mystics who saw the world differently were always there too. They were there wherever there was a god to talk to and a quiet room to talk in. Their visions were real in a way that transcended whether they were also neurological. The craftsmen who lived in their work were there wherever there was stone to carve or metal to forge or cloth to weave with total unwavering concentration. Their concentration was so total that it produced cathedrals and swords and tapestries that still take your breath away 1,000 years later. You close the book. You don't need it anymore. The clinical language is useful. It gives names to things and opens doors to support and understanding and accommodation for real people. But it's not the whole story. The whole story is the one you've been listening to all night. People who were always there, doing what they did, being who they were. Understood and misunderstood. Celebrated and persecuted, absorbed and rejected by every society they've ever been part of throughout all the long centuries of human civilization. The diagnosis is new, the people are ancient, and that, more than any clinical paper or historical document, is the thing most worth knowing tonight. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. Canna's original 11 patients included a boy named Donald Triplett, sometimes called Case 1. The first person ever formally diagnosed with autism. Donald lived in Forest, Mississippi his entire life. He was a regular at the local golf course. He travelled the world. He was a valued member of his small southern town. He passed away in 2023 at the age of 89. The first person ever diagnosed with autism lived a long, full, thoroughly ordinary, extraordinary life. He lived in a small community that knew him and accepted him, which sounds, if you think about it, a lot like a medieval village where everyone belonged. You're almost at the end now, and the room is getting softer, the light is lower, the book is closed, and the evening settles around you. But before you drift away entirely, there's one more thing to think about, one more thread to pull from the long tapestry of tonight. And it's this. The medieval world, for all its brutality and superstition and occasional tendency to set people on fire, stumbled onto something remarkable. It accidentally discovered something that modern society is still struggling to figure out. It built environments where neurodivergent people could actually thrive. Not on purpose. Nobody in the 12th century sat down and said, let's design an institution that provides routine and predictability for people who need it. They didn't have those words. They didn't have that framework. They were trying to serve God, or process wool, or build a cathedral, or survive a winter. But in the process of all this building and working and praying, they created structures that researchers would recognize as perfectly calibrated to support neurodivergent minds. Start with the monastery, because it is the most obvious example and also the most instructive. Modern research identifies several environmental factors that help autistic people. Predictable routines, clear rules applied consistently, reduced ambiguity in social interactions, meaningful, engaging work, sensory environments that can be controlled, opportunities for deep focus, freedom from the exhausting performance of neurotypical social behaviour. Now think about what a Benedictine monastery actually provided to those who lived within its walls. The rule of St. Benedict laid out every hour of every day. You rose at the same time, you prayed at the same times, you ate at the same times. You worked at the same times, the expectations were explicit and written down, literally written down, in a document you could consult whenever you were unsure. Social interactions were governed by the rule: when to speak, when to be silent, how to address your superiors, and how to behave at meals together. The Great Silence after Compline meant that from evening until morning, no social performance was required at all. You could simply exist in quiet, in your cell, with your thoughts and your God, and nobody expecting you to make conversation. The silence was a gift, though they called it discipline. The work was meaningful and engaging. Copying manuscripts required intense focus, attention to detail, and the ability to sustain concentration for hours at a time. Tending the monastery garden required deep knowledge of plants, seasons, and natural systems. Brewing beer required precision and patience in equal measure. Building and maintaining the monastery itself required craftsmanship of the highest order. These were not make-work tasks designed to keep idle hands busy. These were skilled, purposeful occupations that produced real value and earned real respect within the monastery and throughout the wider community beyond its walls. And this is the part that makes you want to laugh and cry at the same time. The monks didn't think they were accommodating anyone at all. They thought they were serving God. The routine wasn't an accommodation, it was a spiritual discipline. The silence wasn't a sensory break, it was a form of prayer. The deep focus wasn't a therapeutic intervention, it was devotion. The monastery worked for neurodivergent people not because anyone designed it to be that way, but because the things that serve God and the things that support autistic minds turned out, by some cosmic coincidence or divine joke, to be remarkably similar. Historians still argue whether monasteries actively attracted neurodivergent people or simply retained them better than other medieval institutions. The answer is probably both. If you were a medieval parent with a child who was unusually quiet, unusually focused, unusually indifferent to social niceties, the monastery was the obvious solution. The child would be fed, sheltered, educated, and given meaningful work in an environment that valued the very traits that made village life so difficult. You weren't abandoning your child. You were placing them in the one institution that seemed designed, by God or by Benedict, to make the most of who they were. But the monastery wasn't the only medieval institution that accidentally got it right. Think about the guild system and what it offered a young person. A medieval guild took a young person, gave them a master to learn from, and embedded them in a structured environment with clear hierarchies and expectations. It focused their energy on a single craft for years at a time. The social demands were limited and predictable. The work was hands-on and concrete. The path from apprentice to journeyman to master was clearly marked and universally understood. If you had the skill, you advanced. If not, you stayed. The ambiguity that makes modern workplaces so exhausting for many autistic people, the unwritten rules and office politics, was largely absent from the guild workshop. Think about the medieval village itself. Everybody knew everybody. Roles were clear. The blacksmith was the blacksmith, the baker was the baker. The odd woman who knew about herbs was the odd woman who knew about herbs. You didn't have to constantly recalibrate your social behaviour for new people, because the people and situations were largely the same ones you'd known your whole life. The social scripts were limited and predictable throughout the village. You knew what was expected at market day, at church, at harvest, at feast. Social life is always performance, but the script didn't change every week. And think about how medieval communities interpreted the people who couldn't or wouldn't perform even those limited social scripts. Sometimes badly, yes. The changeling stories tell you that. The witch trials tell you that. But sometimes well, in ways that modern society struggles to match. The church called Hildegard's visions divine instead of pathological. The village gave its hermit a hut and left food at the door without question. The community let its odd craftsman live in his workshop and bought his extraordinary wares and didn't demand that he also be charming at dinner parties. There's a quirky detail that crystallises this. In several medieval English villages, court records show that communities would collectively agree to support certain members. Members who couldn't support themselves, not through formal charity but through informal arrangements where different families would take turns providing food and shelter. These arrangements sometimes lasted for decades. The person being supported was known to everyone, accepted by everyone, and maintained as part of their community. There was no institution, there was no diagnosis. There was just a village that had decided, without any particular fanfare, that this person belonged to them. Modern society has professional support services and diagnostic criteria, and individualised education plans and workplace accommodations and disability rights legislation, and all of these are good. But modern society has also created a world of relentless social complexity, of constant change, of sensory overload, of unwritten rules that multiply faster than anyone can learn. Workplaces that demand not just competence but personality, not just skill but social performance, not just doing the job but being the right kind of person. And for many neurodivergent people, that world is exponentially harder to navigate than anything the medieval period could have thrown at them. This isn't nostalgia. The medieval world was dirty and violent and short-lived and full of plague and famine and injustice. You don't want to live there. Trust me on this. You've been walking through it all night and you've seen the pyres and the witch trials in Bridget Cleary's kitchen. You don't want to go back. But you can learn from it. You can notice that the environments where neurodivergent people have historically thrived share certain features worth preserving. Predictability, clear expectations, meaningful work, manageable social demands, tolerance of eccentricity. You can ask whether modern society provides these things or strips them away. Whether modern society has been systematically stripping them away in the name of progress, efficiency and social conformity is a question worth holding on to tonight. The medieval monastery didn't know it was an autism-friendly environment. The medieval village didn't know it was practicing community-based support for those who needed it. The medieval church didn't know it was reframing neurological difference as spiritual gift. They were just living their lives, doing the best they could with what they understood. And sometimes, without meaning to, they got it right. Not always, not for everyone, but enough that the evidence still glows faintly after 1,000 years. Like embers in a banked fire, the wisdom of those accidental kindnesses still burns softly, waiting to be noticed, waiting to teach us something we have forgotten. You've been walking a long time, through centuries, through monasteries and cathedrals and villages and courtrooms, through fire and silence and song, through the lives of people whose names you know, and people whose names were never recorded, and people who existed in the margins of manuscripts, like the doodles monks drew when they thought nobody was watching. You've been walking, and now the road is levelling out beneath your feet, and the sky is that colour it gets just after the last light fades, that deep blue grey that isn't quite night yet but has given up on being day. Let's take the long view. Let's stand back far enough that the centuries flatten into a single landscape, and let's see what's there. Neurodivergence is not a modern invention. It is not a product of industrialisation, or processed food, or social media, or any of the things anxious commentators blame. The people were always there. They were there when the first cave paintings went up on the walls at Lascaux, made by someone extraordinary. Someone who could see the shape of a horse in the curve of a rock wall, with a precision that still stops you cold 40,000 years later. They were there when the first cities were built in Mesopotamia, and someone had to design the irrigation systems with extraordinary focus and precision. The person who designed it was probably the kind of person who could think about water flow for 16 hours straight and not get bored, and also not remember to eat lunch. They were there in ancient Greece, where Aristotle categorized literally everything he encountered, from the parts of animals to the structure of dramatic poetry. His compulsive thoroughness would be called restricted interest in a modern diagnostic assessment. Yet he built a framework for understanding the world that lasted 2,000 years. They were there in the medieval monasteries you've spent so much time in tonight, and in the Islamic libraries and the Chinese examination halls, and in the Indian temple, complexes and everywhere else, that human civilization built structures that rewarded intense focus and deep systematic thinking. The monks are still copying, do you understand that? Not literally. The scriptoriums are museums now, or ruins, or tourist attractions where you can buy postcards. But the impulse is still there. The person who spends 12 hours debugging a single line of code. The person who memorises every train schedule in the country. The person who builds model ships in bottles with a precision that would make a medieval goldsmith weep. The monks are still copying, They just use different tools. The bells are still ringing. The human need for structure, for rhythm, for a day divided into predictable segments, that need didn't disappear when the monasteries dissolved. It just relocated. Every person who sets 17 alarms on their phone, every person who eats the same breakfast every morning for 20 years without variation, every person who feels genuine distress when the schedule changes without warning. The bells are still ringing for them, even if they can't hear them. Hildegard is still composing. The people who experience the world in overwhelming sensory detail, who hear colours and see music and feel textures with astonishing intensity. That intensity is both gift and burden. They're still here, making art that comes from a place most people can't access, translating perceptions most people can't share. Every musician who composes from synesthesia, every artist who paints from sensory overwhelm, every writer who captures the precise shade of light at 4 in the afternoon. Hildegard is still composing. Thomas is still thinking. The systematic minds, the people who build cathedral-sized structures of logic and argument with tireless precision. Who can hold 1,000 variables in their head and see how they connect? Who won't rest until the system is complete and consistent and beautiful in its thoroughness? Thomas is still thinking. He's in the research labs and the philosophy departments and the server rooms and the patent offices, and he's still not great at parties. Julian is still writing. The people who need solitude the way other people need company, who do their best work in small rooms with the door closed, who find that the world makes more sense when there's less of it pressing in. Julian is still writing. Her anchor hold has changed, but her need for solitude hasn't. She hasn't left the house in 3 days because she doesn't need to, and the words are flowing and the silence is perfect. They were always there, and they always will be. The diagnostic categories will change, the social frameworks will shift, the stories we tell about why some people are different will evolve. Fairy changeling, divine mystic, medical diagnosis, neurodivergent identity. But the people will remain, because neurodivergence isn't a disease to be cured or a problem to be solved. It's a variation in the human operating system that has been present since there was a human operating system to vary. It has always been part of us. Historians still argue whether medieval society was better or worse for neurodivergent people than modern society. The answer, like most answers that matter, is both. It was better in some ways, more routine, more community, more tolerance of eccentricity within established roles, more willingness to interpret difference as meaningful rather than pathological. It was worse in others. Changeling beliefs, witch trials, no medical understanding, no legal protections, and no language for self-advocacy or identity. The truth lives in the tension between these two realities, and the tension is where the interesting thinking happens. Both truths must be held together. What you can take from tonight, if you take anything at all, is this. The long view matters. When you zoom out far enough, the moral panic fades. The rising autism diagnoses look less like an epidemic and more like a recognition. A slow, stumbling, imperfect recognition that these people have been here all along. Contributing all along, suffering all along, and deserving better all along. The diagnosis didn't create them, it just gave them a name. And now the room is dimming, truly dimming, and the history is settling around you like dust in a beam of light, and you can let it go. The candles in the monastery have burned down to nubs. The last brother has closed his manuscript and covered the inkpot and flexed his stiff fingers. He walked slowly down the stone corridor to his cell. The bells have rung for Compline, the final office of the day, and the great silence has fallen. The great silence has fallen over the cloister like a soft wool blanket. No more talking, no more questions, just the sound of the wind in the cloister garden, and the distant breathing of the monks in their cells and the faint scratch of a mouse behind the chapel wall. Everything is settling into stillness now. The cathedral town outside the walls is quieting too. The blacksmith has banked his forge. The baker's ovens are cooling. The market square is empty now. Just the cobblestones and the evening air and a cat picking its way carefully across the puddles from this afternoon's rain. The town sleeps peacefully tonight. The odd woman who knows about herbs has closed her shutters. The hermit on the hill has said his last prayer and wrapped himself in his rough cloak. He has turned his face to the wall. The sky is deep and wide and full of stars that no one has named yet. The same stars Hildegard watched. The same stars that Julian could see through the narrow window of her anchor hold, if she stood on her toes and tilted her head just right. The same stars that lit the way for every pilgrim and monk and scholar and craftsman who ever walked through the world being exactly irreducibly stubbornly themselves. The fire is embers now, just a soft glow in the heart.